On Mount Olympus, beauty was more than vanity. It was power. And among all the gods, no one wielded golden perfection quite like Apollo. But sometimes, even the smallest divine indulgence can ripple through the mortal world in ways no one expects. This is the tale of how one god's haircut would send the seasons into disarray, and how a single mortal girl might be the only one who could stop the chaos before the earth itself unraveled. Chapter 1. The Golden Mane. The celestial Salon atop Mount Olympus gleamed with divine radiance, its marble floors polished to mirror perfection. Apollo stood before his favorite mirror, a sheet of liquid silver, running his fingers through golden hair that fell past his shoulders in perfect waves. Magnificent, he murmured to his reflection. Absolutely divine. Which, of course, it was. Apollo was nothing if not literal about such things. He had been growing his hair for 3 mortal months now, ever since the incident. The memory still made him cringe. Hermes had burst into the Salon that fateful day, claiming he'd invented a revolutionary new styling product made from concentrated cloud essence and lightning extract. Trust me, cousin. Hermes had grinned, already slathering the glowing gel through Apollo's pristine locks. The mortals will go wild for this look. What followed was 3 hours of Apollo's hair standing completely vertical, crackling with electrical energy, and changing colors every few seconds. Purple, green, orange, and a particularly unfortunate shade of mud brown. Worse yet, every time he tried to speak, his voice came out in squeaks and honks like a demented goose. Hermes had laughed so hard he'd fallen off Mount Olympus. Twice. The other gods had been no better. Athena had taken sketches. Dionysus had composed drinking songs about it. Even Zeus had chuckled, which was perhaps the most humiliating part of all. Never again. But now his hair had reached new heights of perfection. It was time for a trim. He selected his favorite shears, blessed silver blades that hummed with power. As he lifted them to his hair, Apollo caught sight of his scrying pool showing the mortal world below. The image showed rolling hills of ancient Greece, where farmers prepared their fields for planting season. Among them, a young woman with dirt-stained hands was doing something peculiar. She knelt beside each plot, pressing her ear to the ground as if listening for something. While other farmers worked with tools, she seemed to be having conversations with the earth itself. Odd little mortal, Apollo muttered, barely sparing her a glance. He had more important things to attend to. Schnuppen. Golden strands floated to the marble floor, dissolving into motes of light. Apollo smiled with satisfaction. Snip, snip. As he worked, humming one of his own compositions, Apollo remained completely absorbed in his reflection. He didn't notice the scrying pool beginning to ripple with unusual activity. Snip, snip, snip. Down in the mortal realm, something impossible was happening. In the fields of Greece, farmers who had been preparing for late winter planting suddenly stopped their work, staring in amazement at their surroundings. The air, which moments before had carried the crisp bite of winter's end, now felt warm and soft against their skin. Buds that should have remained dormant for another month began to swell on fruit trees. Grass that had been brown and brittle started to show hints of green. Old Nicias, who had been farming the same plot of land for 40 years, dropped his plow handle and knelt to touch the earth. The soil felt warm beneath his weathered fingers. "By the gods," he whispered, "it's as if spring has come early." But the young woman who had been listening to the earth, Thalia, shot to her feet with alarm. Unlike the other farmers who marveled at the sudden warmth, she looked terrified. "No, no, no," she muttered, pressing her hands to her temples. "This is all wrong. The earth is screaming that it's not ready. The roots aren't prepared. The soil hasn't had time to rest." She spun in a circle, watching in horror as buds forced themselves open on fruit trees and grass pushed through the ground in unnatural haste. To everyone else, it looked like a miracle. To Thalia, who had spent her life learning to hear what the earth was really saying, it looked like chaos. "Something is making this happen," she said, her voice carrying a certainty that made nearby farmers pause in their celebration. "Something powerful. And if it doesn't stop..." She trailed off, but her expression said everything. This wasn't a blessing. It was a disaster waiting to unfold. Meanwhile, Apollo admired his reflection, completely oblivious to the fact that his casual haircut was about to turn the mortal world upside down. After all, what could a simple trim possibly have to do with the seasons? Snip. Chapter 2. The Accidental Discovery. Apollo stepped back from his mirror, admiring his handiwork with the satisfaction of an artist completing a masterpiece. Perfect. The other gods would be positively green with envy at tonight's quarterly divine assembly. He swept the remaining golden clippings into a celestial dustpan, watching them dissolve into sparkles of pure light. As the last motes faded, a strange tingling sensation rippled through him, like the moment just before lightning strikes. "Probably just pre-party excitement," he murmured, already imagining Aphrodite's jealous stare. But down in the mortal world, Thalia pressed her hands against the earth and felt it screaming. 3 hours later, Apollo materialized in the Great Hall of Olympus with his usual flair for dramatic timing. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Even Aphrodite paused mid-sentence. "Apollo," Zeus rumbled from his throne, "you look different." "New haircut," Apollo replied with studied casualness, running a hand through his locks. "Just a little trim." "It's magnificent," Artemis breathed, though her expression suggested she was already planning to outdo him. Apollo settled into his throne, basking in the attention. The assembly droned on, Poseidon complaining about plastic in his oceans, Athena presenting quarterly wisdom statistics, the usual divine bureaucracy. Apollo barely listened, too busy admiring his reflection in the polished marble. Then Demeter rose, and Apollo's self-admiration session came to an abrupt halt. "I have disturbing news," she announced, her voice cutting through the divine chatter like a scythe. "There are irregularities in the natural order. Across Greece, spring is arriving weeks early. Farmers report warm soil, premature budding, grass growing at impossible rates." Apollo's hand, which had been casually moving toward his hair, froze mid-gesture. "Concerning." Zeus frowned. "What's causing it?" "Unknown." Demeter's frustration was palpable. "My seasonal systems have operated flawlessly for millennia. Something powerful has disrupted the balance." Apollo's divine stomach performed an uncomfortable somersault. Coincidence? Had to be. Gods got haircuts constantly. It couldn't possibly. The timing is precise, Demeter continued, her sharp gaze sweeping the assembly. The disruption began exactly 3 hours ago. Right at midday, Apollo croaked. Every divine eye in the hall turned to Apollo. He felt like a deer caught in the headlights of Zeus's chariot. Me? No. Absolutely nothing. His voice climbed an octave. Just ordinary sun duties. Very routine. Completely normal. You're sweating, Hermes observed with obvious delight. Actual golden perspiration. Haven't seen that since the hair gel incident. I am not sweating, Apollo protested, though he could feel divine moisture beading on his forehead. I'm glistening, majestically. But his mind was racing. The timing, the tingling sensation, the way Demeter's eyes seemed to bore straight through his immortal soul. Before Zeus could continue, the great doors burst open. A wind spirit tumbled in, her wispy form crackling with panic. Forgive me, great ones, she gasped. Emergency report. The spring disruption, it's following Apollo's sun path. Flowers blooming in exact patterns matching his chariot route. The mortals are calling it Apollo's wake. The silence that followed was deafening. Apollo stared at his hands as if they'd suddenly grown extra fingers. The evidence was mounting like an avalanche, and he was standing directly in its path. Apollo. Zeus's voice could have shattered mountains. Explain. Now. Apollo's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The truth felt impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. I might have, possibly, gotten a haircut today. He squeaked. A haircut. Demeter's voice was flat as a tombstone. Just a tiny trim, barely noticeable, though it does frame my face beautifully. Apollo. Demeter's roar shook the marble columns. Are you telling me that your vanity is disrupting the fundamental forces of nature? Apollo shrank in his throne. When you put it like that, it sounds bad, but there is no but. Demeter's eyes blazed with green fire. Do you have any idea what you've done? Apollo looked around desperately for support and found none. Even Aphrodite was shaking her head in disapproval. I didn't know. He protested. There's no chapter in the divine handbook about hair care and seasonal disruption. Because, Athena said with clinical precision, no one else is vain enough to accidentally control the weather with their grooming routine. Dionysus was still chuckling. Wait until the mortals find out their crops depend on Apollo's styling choices. But Demeter wasn't laughing. Her face had gone pale, then green, then a terrifying shade of volcanic red. Apollo, she said with deadly quiet, do you understand what premature spring means? Apollo, who had never given mortal agriculture a single thought, shook his head. Famine. The word dropped like a stone into still water. Crops planted too early die in late frost. Fruit trees that bloom now bear no fruit. Animals wake from hibernation to find no food. You haven't just disrupted the seasons. You've potentially doomed thousands to starvation. The weight of her words crashed over Apollo like a tidal wave. Around the hall, divine faces showed everything from amusement to horror to barely concealed panic. But Apollo's voice was barely a whisper. But I look fantastic. The silence stretched like a bowstring about to snap. Then Demeter rose from her throne, power radiating from her like heat from a forge. Plants began sprouting from the marble floor around her feet, not the gentle growth of spring, but wild, angry vines that cracked stone. Apollo, she said, her voice carrying the rumble of earthquakes and the whisper of dying harvests. You and I are going to have a very long conversation about responsibility. For the first time in his immortal existence, Apollo wondered if maybe, just maybe, there might be more important things than perfect hair. The thought terrified him almost as much as Demeter's glowing green eyes. In Chapter 3, The Experiment. Apollo had never been sent to his room before. In all his millennia of existence, through the Trojan War incident, that awkward business with Daphne, and the time he'd accidentally turned King Midas's daughter into a golden statue for a week, Zeus had never actually grounded him like a misbehaving child. The humiliation burned worse than Helios's old sun chariot. He paced his marble chambers, catching glimpses of himself in every reflective surface. His hair still looked magnificent, which should have been consolation enough. But instead of admiring his reflection, Apollo found himself studying it with new eyes. What if the connection wasn't accidental? What if he could control it? The thought hit him like lightning, electric and dangerous. All these eons, he'd been just another god with assigned duties: drive the sun, inspire some poetry, look devastatingly handsome. Important work, certainly, but hardly groundbreaking. But this could change everything. Apollo approached his grooming station like a moth drawn to flame. His silver shears gleamed with possibility, whispering promises of power beyond imagination. Just a tiny test, he breathed, his hands trembling with anticipation. One microscopic snip, for scientific purposes. The lie tasted sweet on his tongue. Down in the mortal world, Thalia pressed her palms against the ancient olive tree's roots, her face pale with exhaustion. The earth's voice had become a constant scream, plants crying out in confusion, soil begging for rest, roots tangled in panic. It's getting worse, she whispered to her father. The earth is... It's in agony, Papa. Everything is being forced to grow against its nature. Nicias knelt beside his daughter, worry etched deep in his weathered face. The other farmers think it's a blessing. Early spring means early harvest, more food. They're wrong. Thalia's voice cracked. This isn't natural growth. It's like someone is screaming at a sleeping child to wake up and run a race. The plants are terrified. A warm breeze swept through the grove, carrying the impossible scent of summer flowers in winter air. Thalia felt the earth convulse beneath her hands, and she knew with horrible certainty that whatever divine force was causing this chaos was about to strike again. "Please," she whispered to the sky, "please stop." Apollo made the cut. One strand, golden as sunlight, sharp as destiny. It drifted to the marble floor and dissolved into nothing. The world exploded into spring. His scrying pool erupted with images, vineyards bursting into leaf, wheat fields materializing from bare earth, fruit trees detonating into blossom with such violence that petals fell like snow. The transformation raced outward from grease like ripples in a pond, unstoppable and magnificent. "By the fates," Apollo whispered, his voice thick with awe. "It actually works." Power coursed through him like wine, intoxicating and warm. He watched farmers stumble from their homes, some weeping with joy, others fleeing in terror. Mortals fell to their knees, praying to gods who had no idea what was happening. But Apollo knew. Apollo controlled it. Then the scrying pool showed him Thalia, collapsed in her olive grove, her father cradling her as she convulsed with the earth's pain. The image should have stopped him, should have filled him with remorse. Instead, Apollo found himself studying his reflection, admiring how the divine power made his eyes glow with inner light. He looked like what he'd always been meant to be, not just another pretty god, but a force of nature itself. Snip. The second cut unleashed chaos. Spring didn't just arrive. It exploded across the Mediterranean like divine wildfire. Flowers bloomed so fast, their stems couldn't support them. Trees leafed out with such violence their branches cracked under the sudden weight. Bears stumbled from caves, blinking in confusion at a world that had transformed overnight. Apollo threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing through his chambers like music. "I am the master of seasons. I can reshape the world with a thought." He spun through his chambers, drunk on power more intoxicating than any ambrosia. No more taking orders. No more being just another pretty face in Zeus's court. He could be the god who controlled life itself, who made mortals dance to his whims, who... Farmers fleeing fields where crops grew too fast to harvest. Children crying as familiar landscapes transformed into alien gardens. Animals wandering in circles, their instincts shattered by the impossible season. And Thalia, motionless in her father's arms, blood trickling from her ears as the earth's screaming overwhelmed her mortal mind. The sight should have sobered him, should have filled him with horror. Instead, Apollo felt only a flicker of annoyance. Mortals were so fragile, so dramatic. Surely they'd adapt. Boom, boom, boom. Apollo! Demeter's voice could have cracked the foundations of Olympus. "I know what you're doing. Stop this madness." Apollo clutched his shears protectively. The power thrummed through him like a heartbeat, demanding more. Just one more cut. Just one more taste of absolute control. "You can't stop me," he whispered to the door. "I found something incredible." His reflection smiled back at him, beautiful and terrible and drunk on possibility. The door exploded inward. Demeter stood in the wreckage, terrible and magnificent, her hair writhing like living vines, her eyes blazing with the fury of 1,000 harvests. Where her feet touched marble, angry roots erupted through stone. The very air around her crackled with the power of nature unleashed. Put down the shears. Apollo backed against his mirror, clutching his tools like a child with a forbidden toy. You don't understand. I've discovered something revolutionary. I can control the seasons. You're murdering the natural order. Demeter advanced, and with each step, the room filled with the wild growth of her rage. Vines cracked marble. Roots split stone. Look at what you've done. She gestured toward the scrying pool, where chaos reigned supreme. But Apollo barely glanced at the destruction. His eyes were fixed on his reflection, on the way power made him glow with divine light. I can perfect it, he insisted, his voice high and desperate. I just need more practice, more experiments. I can learn to control. There is no control! Demeter's roar shook Mount Olympus itself. Trees burst through the ceiling, their branches reaching toward Apollo like grasping fingers. You are a child playing with forces beyond your comprehension. For a moment, just a moment, Apollo saw himself as she did, a vain god drunk on power, willing to sacrifice mortal lives for the thrill of control. The image should have shamed him. Instead, it thrilled him. Maybe, he whispered, raising the shears one final time. That's exactly what the world needs. Demeter's eyes went wide with horror as she realized the truth. Apollo wasn't going to stop. He was just getting started. Chapter 4. The Mortal Consequences. The Athenian marketplace had descended into madness. Alexios clutched his merchant's ledger with white knuckles, watching his life's work crumble before his eyes. 3 generations of his family had built their grain business on the predictable rhythm of seasons. Winter wheat, spring barley, summer storage, autumn sales. It was as reliable as sunrise. Until today. 50 drachmas for winter wheat, he called desperately, his voice cracking. Yesterday, the same grain had commanded 200. Why buy old grain when I've got fresh barley? Laughed Lydia, a farmer whose impossible harvest had made her the marketplace's newest sensation. Picked this morning from fields that were bare yesterday. The gods smile upon us. Alexios stared at her overflowing baskets. Fresh green barley in the dead of winter. It defied everything he knew about farming, about seasons, about the natural order itself. My children will starve, he whispered, but his words were lost in the chaos of vendors hawking impossible produce and buyers scrambling to understand a world gone mad. In the hills outside Corinth, Demetrios knelt beside his dying ewe. Penelope had been with him for 7 years, through harsh winters and scorching summers. She'd birthed 12 lambs and survived wolves, storms, and drought. But she couldn't survive this impossible spring that felt like midsummer. I'm sorry, old girl, he whispered, stroking her overheated wool. I don't know how to help you. The ewe's breathing was shallow, rapid. Around them, the rest of his flock huddled in whatever shade they could find, their thick winter coats now death sentences in the unseasonable heat. 3 sheep had already died. More would follow. Demetrios had inherited this flock from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 50 years of shepherding, and he'd never felt so helpless. All his knowledge, all his experience, meant nothing when the very seasons betrayed him. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from pyres where other shepherds burned their dead animals. The mountain air, which should have been crisp with winter cold, shimmered with heat waves and the stench of loss. Thalia woke to screaming. Not human screaming, though she could hear her father's raised voice through the walls. This was deeper, more primal. The earth itself was shrieking in her mind, a constant assault of botanical agony that made her skull feel like it might split open. She pressed her palms against her ears, but it did no good. The voices came from inside her head now, a chorus of confused plants and tortured soil that had been building for days. Too fast, too fast, too fast, whispered the olive trees. Not ready, not ready, not ready, sobbed the wheat. Help us, help us, help us, pleaded the very ground beneath her feet. My daughter says the earth is in distress, her father was saying outside. Your daughter is touched in the head. Petros scoffed. My olive trees are heavy with fruit. I'll make enough silver to buy 3 more plots. And when they try to fruit again in true spring, that was Sophia, the village elder. What happens when your trees exhaust themselves, producing twice in 1 year? Thalia struggled to her feet, the room spinning around her. Through her window, she could see the chaos Petros refused to acknowledge. Children cried as their parents argued. Farmers stood paralyzed in fields that defied all natural law. And everywhere, the impossible abundance that felt more like a curse than a blessing. She stumbled outside, desperate to escape the cacophony in her head, only to find it grew stronger in the open air. Captain Stavros stood on the dock at Piraeus, watching his crew unload cargo that had become worthless overnight. Wool cloaks, heating oil, preserved winter foods. 3 months ago, when he'd loaded these goods in Alexandria, they'd represented a fortune. The seasonal trade routes were as predictable as the tides. Winter goods to Greece, spring luxuries back to Egypt, summer wines to Rome. Now his hold full of winter merchandise faced a market that had somehow skipped straight to spring. I'll give you 10 drachmas for the lot, offered a merchant, barely glancing at the fine wool cloaks that had cost Stavros 50 drachmas each. 10 drachmas. Stavros's voice cracked. These cloaks are worth nothing in this heat. The merchant shrugged. My customers are demanding linen and cooling oils. Can't sell wool when it feels like summer. Stavros looked around the harbor, seeing his ruin reflected in every captain's face. Ships that should have been profitable sat heavy with unwanted cargo. Crews that should have been celebrating successful voyages instead gathered in worried clusters, sharing rumors that grew more impossible with each telling. Heard from a captain out of Crete, muttered old Nikos, a sailor whose weathered hands shook as he spoke. Says he saw snow falling on blooming orange trees. Snow and flowers at the same time. The gods have gone mad, whispered another, and we're paying the price. Apollo paced his chambers like a caged lion, his scrying pool flickering between scenes of mortal chaos. The confrontation with Demeter had shaken him more than he cared to admit. She'd stormed out with threats about Zeus, about consequences, about responsibility. But she hadn't actually stopped him. and the power still thrummed in his veins like liquid fire. "It's growing pains," he told himself, watching Lydia celebrate her impossible harvest. "They'll adapt. Mortals always adapt." But the pool shifted, showing him Alexios clutching his worthless ledger, his children's faces gaunt with worry. Then Demetrios weeping over his dying sheep. Then Stavros staring at cargo that had become worthless overnight. And Thalia stumbling through her village with blood trickling from her ears, the earth's agony written across her face. Apollo's reflection caught his eye, golden hair disheveled, eyes bright with manic energy. He looked like a god drunk on power, which, he supposed, he was. "I could fix it," he whispered, his hand drifting toward his shears. One precise cut, just to stabilize things. The lie tasted sweet on his tongue. He wasn't trying to fix anything. He was addicted to the rush of reshaping reality, to the intoxicating knowledge that he could make the world dance to his whims. His fingers closed around the silver handles. "Just one more adjustment," he breathed, "for their own good." "Ah!" Down in the mortal world, Thalia fell to her knees in the olive grove. The earth's voice had become unbearable, a constant shriek of botanical agony that made her vision blur and her hands shake. She pressed her palms against the soil, trying to offer what comfort she could to the tortured ground. "Make it stop," pleaded the roots beneath her fingers. "Can't breathe, can't grow, can't rest," sobbed the ancient olive tree. "Dying, dying, dying," whispered the grass. "I know," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I know it hurts. I'm trying to understand." She looked up at the sky, where somewhere beyond the clouds, the gods played their incomprehensible games with mortal lives. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Whoever you are, whatever you're doing, the earth is dying. We're all dying. Please stop." But the only answer was the wind, carrying the scent of impossible flowers and the distant sound of her neighbors arguing over crops that shouldn't exist. The gods, it seemed, had more important things to worry about than the pleas of one small mortal girl. For now. So Chapter 5. Demeter's investigation. Demeter's hands shook as she pressed them against the ancient oak. For 3 days, the earth had been screaming. Not the gentle whispers she was used to, the patient murmur of roots, the sleepy sighs of seeds, but raw, agonized shrieks that made her divine essence recoil in horror. "Show me," she commanded the oak, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Show me who did this." The tree's memories flowed through her like poison. Apollo's golden hair catching sunlight, the flash of silver shears, the precise moment when divine vanity had shattered the natural order. She saw it all. His first accidental cut, his growing fascination, his deliberate experiments with forces he couldn't begin to comprehend. "That vain, reckless fool," she snarled, her power making the grove tremble. Flowers bloomed and withered around her feet in rapid succession, mirroring her rage. But anger alone wouldn't be enough. She needed evidence that would make even Zeus take notice. Evidence that would force the king of gods to act before Apollo's addiction destroyed everything she had spent millennia protecting. Apollo couldn't stop staring at his shears. They lay on his grooming table like a loaded weapon, silver blades gleaming with the promise of power. His reflection in their polished surface looked haggard, golden hair disheveled from constant touching, eyes bright with manic energy, the face of a god drunk on possibility. Just one more adjustment, he whispered for the 100th time. One precise cut to fix everything. His scrying pool flickered with scenes of chaos. Rain falling upward in Sicily, snow blooming into flowers in Egypt, trees growing autumn leaves and spring buds simultaneously. The Mediterranean had become a canvas of impossible weather, and he was the artist holding the brush. The rational part of his mind, the part that sounded disturbingly like Artemis, whispered that he should stop. That each cut made things worse, not better. That he was spiraling out of control. But the larger part, the part that thrummed with addictive power, whispered something else entirely. You could fix it all. You could be the god who controls the very seasons. You could be more powerful than Zeus himself. His fingers twitched toward the shears. The knock shattered his trance like breaking glass. Apollo? Artemis's voice carried a gentleness that made his stomach clench with guilt. I need to talk to you. Apollo's hands flew to his hair, trying to smooth the evidence of his obsessive touching. The shears disappeared into a drawer with divine speed. Come in, sister. You look concerned. Artemis entered like a silver shadow, her bow across her shoulder, her expression grave. She had always been his opposite. Where he was impulsive, she was measured. Where he was vain, she was practical. Where he saw opportunity, she saw consequences. My hunters are terrified, she said without preamble. They speak of forests where winter and summer exist in the same tree, of animals dying from confusion, their instincts shattered by impossible seasons. They're calling it the season of madness, and they're not wrong. Apollo's laugh sounded hollow even to his own ears. Mortals love their drama. A little unusual weather. Stop. Artemis's silver eyes pinned him like arrows. I know you, Apollo. I've known you for millennia, and I know that look in your eyes. The same look you had when you discovered you could make music that could charm the dead, or when you learned to drive the sun chariot. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. You've found something new to obsess over, haven't you? Something connected to your hair. Apollo's hand moved instinctively toward his hair, then stopped. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating it directly. Artemis stepped closer, her silver eyes searching his face. You've discovered that your hair affects the seasons, haven't you? The words hung between them like a death sentence. Apollo felt his carefully constructed denials crumble under his sister's knowing gaze. It started as an accident, he whispered, collapsing into his chair. Just a haircut. But then I realized what I could do, and I couldn't stop myself. Show me. Apollo gestured weakly toward his scrying pool, which flickered to life with scenes of chaos. Farmers fleeing impossible harvests. Animals dying from seasonal confusion. Children crying as their world transformed into something alien and wrong. I thought I could control it, he said, his voice barely audible. I thought I could create paradise, Eternal spring, endless abundance, no more famines or droughts. Apollo. Artemis knelt beside his chair, her voice gentle but firm. Look at your paradise. Really look at it. The scrying pool shifted, showing them Thalia collapsed in her olive grove, blood trickling from her ears. Demetrios weeping over his dying sheep. Alexios watching his life's work crumble to dust. They're suffering, Artemis said quietly. Your paradise is killing them. I can fix it. The words exploded from Apollo with desperate intensity. I just need more time, more experiments. I can learn to control it properly. Listen to yourself. Artemis's voice cracked with pain. You sound like an addict, Apollo, like someone who's lost all perspective. The word addict hit Apollo like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his divine pride warring with a growing sense of horror at what he'd become. I am not an addict, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I am a god exploring the boundaries of my power. You are my brother, Artemis said, tears gleaming in her silver eyes. And I'm watching you destroy yourself and everyone else. Before Apollo could respond, the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost spread across the marble floor, and the very air seemed to thicken with barely contained fury. No, said a voice from the doorway, cold as winter's heart. They are not your powers to command. Vines crept along the doorframe behind her, and where her feet touched marble, flowers bloomed and immediately died, a grotesque parody of the natural cycle Apollo had shattered. Demeter, Apollo managed, his usual charm deserting him entirely. I can explain. Explain? Demeter's laugh was like breaking glass. Explain how you've been torturing my domain for days? Explain how you've turned the earth itself into your personal plaything? She stepped into the room, and the air filled with images, not from Apollo's scrying pool, but from nature itself. The oak tree's memories of his first cut, the earth's testimony of each subsequent experiment, the agonized screams of plants forced to grow against their nature. I have spent 3 days gathering evidence, Demeter said, her voice deadly quiet. 3 days listening to the earth weep, watching trees die from confusion, feeling the very soil cry out in pain. And do you know what I discovered? Apollo shrank back, but she advanced relentlessly. I discovered that you vain, reckless child, have somehow bound your hair to the seasonal cycles themselves. Every cut sends shockwaves through the natural order. Every trim is an act of torture against the living world. Her eyes blazed with green fire. I discovered that you have been destroying everything I've spent millennia protecting, all for the sake of your precious vanity. Apollo's back hit the wall, but his pride flared like a cornered animal. You don't understand. I could end famines, prevent droughts, create eternal abundance. Look around you. Demeter's roar shook the mountain itself. Trees burst through the marble floor, their branches reaching toward Apollo like accusing fingers. Your abundance is death. Your paradise is torture. You are not creating, you are destroying. I can learn to control it. No, Artemis's quiet voice cut through the chaos like a silver blade. Apollo, stop. Please. I'm begging you as your sister. Stop before you destroy everything we love. Apollo looked between them, Demeter blazing with righteous fury, Artemis shining with desperate love, and felt something crack inside his chest. For the first time since discovering his power, he saw himself as they did. Not a revolutionary god bringing paradise to mortals, but a vain addict willing to torture the world for his next fix. His voice broke. I can't. The power, I need it. I can reshape reality itself. How can you ask me to give that up? The admission hung in the air like a confession of guilt. Demeter's fury seemed to drain away, replaced by something far more frightening, pity. Because, she said softly, addiction is not power. Apollo, it's slavery. She stepped closer, and he could smell the earth on her, rich soil and patient roots, the quiet wisdom of seeds that knew when to grow and when to rest. I'm going to give you one chance, she said, her voice gentle as falling leaves. One opportunity to end this before it destroys you completely. Put down the shears, let your hair grow, allow the natural order to heal. Apollo's hand twitched toward the drawer where his shears lay hidden. Even now, even faced with the evidence of his destruction, the addiction whispered its seductive promises. One more cut, just one more taste of godlike power. And if I refuse, he whispered. Demeter's expression hardened like winter frost. Then I take this to Zeus, and I make sure he understands that his golden son has become a threat to the very foundations of existence. The ultimatum hung between them like a blade. Apollo felt the weight of choice pressing down on him, his addiction warring with the growing horror of what he'd become. I need time, he said finally. What you have until sunset. Demeter turned toward the door, then paused. Apollo, I genuinely hope you choose wisely, because if you don't, I will stop you myself, and you won't enjoy my methods. Then she was gone, leaving Apollo alone with Artemis, his reflection, and the terrible knowledge that he was standing at the edge of an abyss, and part of him wanted to jump. On Chapter 6, The Divine Salon Wars. Sunset came and went. Apollo never moved from his mirror. Demeter's ultimatum had expired hours ago. By now, she would be standing before Zeus, presenting her evidence, demanding justice. Soon, the king of gods would summon him for judgment that could strip away his divine powers, exile him to Tartarus, or worse. Apollo knew all this, understood the consequences, felt the weight of impending doom pressing down on his immortal shoulders. And he didn't care. The addiction had consumed everything else. Fear, reason, self-preservation. All that remained was the hunger, the desperate need for one more cut, one more taste of absolute power. They don't understand, he whispered to his reflection. They can't see the beauty of what I'm creating. His reflection nodded back, eyes bright with manic certainty. In the mirror, Apollo looked magnificent, a god on the verge of transcendence, ready to reshape reality itself. The shears called to him like a siren song, silver blades that promised godhood beyond imagination. One more cut, Just one more, and you'll show them all. His trembling fingers closed around the handles. Snip. Reality shattered like glass. This wasn't the controlled chaos of Apollo's previous experiments. This was power unleashed without restraint, without thought, without any consideration for consequences. The Mediterranean convulsed as impossible weather patterns exploded across its surface. In Egypt, the Nile reversed its flow, its waters turning to liquid gold that burned everything it touched. In Rome, olive trees grew fruit of actual silver, their branches snapping under the impossible weight. In Athens, flowers bloomed with such violent intensity that their perfume became a toxic cloud, sending mortals fleeing in terror. But Apollo barely noticed the destruction. He was drunk on power, intoxicated by the rush of reshaping reality with a single cut. And for the first time, he had a plan that went beyond mere experimentation. He activated his scrying pool, his divine image appearing in the sky above every mortal settlement from Greece to Egypt. People of the Mediterranean, his voice rang out like golden thunder. I am Apollo, god of the sun, master of light, and now, controller of seasons themselves. In her olive grove, Thalia looked up from the tortured earth, her face streaked with tears and blood from her ears. The earth's screaming had become unbearable, but now she heard something worse, the voice of a god gone completely mad. You have suffered from chaos, Apollo continued, his image shimmering with divine radiance. But I offer you order, perfect harvests, controlled weather, an end to uncertainty forever. His smile was beautiful and terrible. For a modest tribute, gold for spring, silver for summer, bronze for autumn, I will grant you the seasons you desire. Pay my price, and your fields will flourish beyond your wildest dreams. The audacity was breathtaking. Apollo had moved beyond experimentation, beyond addiction. He was now holding the natural world hostage for profit. In Zeus's throne room, Demeter collapsed to her knees. The latest wave of chaos hit her like a physical blow, tearing through her divine essence with the force of 1,000 dying forests. She had been presenting her case against Apollo with methodical precision, building an argument that even the king of gods couldn't ignore. Now, as reality itself convulsed around them, words became irrelevant. Demeter! Zeus rose from his throne, lightning crackling around his form. What's happening? She couldn't answer. The earth's agony flooded through her, every plant forced to grow against its nature, every season torn from its proper place, every natural law shattered by divine madness. Blood trickled from her nose as she struggled to process the sheer scope of the destruction. Then the reports began flooding in. Minor gods and spirits burst through the throne room doors, their voices overlapping in panic. The Nile burns with liquid gold. Silver fruit is crushing the trees. The very air has become poison. But it was the wind spirit's final report that made Demeter's blood freeze. Apollo is speaking to the mortals. He's selling them the seasons. Zeus's roar shook the foundations of Olympus. He's what? Demeter struggled to her feet, her divine form blazing with fury that made the air itself catch fire. He's not just destroying the natural order, she snarled. He's monetizing it, turning survival itself into a commodity. Bring me Apollo immediately. No. Demeter's voice carried the implacable force of continental drift. This has moved beyond your authority, Zeus. He has declared war on nature itself. She turned to face the assembled gods, her eyes blazing with the fury of every wildfire, every drought, every ecological disaster that had ever scarred the earth. Apollo wants to control my domain? Then let him face me directly. Apollo was counting his first tributes when the mountain began to scream. It started as a tremor, barely noticeable, like a distant earthquake. Then his marble floor cracked, and something dark and furious began pushing through the fissures. Vines erupted from the stone like striking serpents. Not the gentle growth of normal plants, but something twisted and aggressive. Thorny roses that drew divine blood, strangling ivy that moved with predatory intelligence, poisonous nightshade that filled the air with the scent of death itself. Apollo. The voice came from everywhere at once, the walls, the floor, the very air itself. You want to play God with my domain? Then face the consequences. Apollo clutched his shears and backed toward his window, but the assault followed him. This wasn't like his controlled experiments. This was nature itself, wild and furious and completely beyond reason. Vines lashed at him like whips. Thorns sought his divine flesh with malicious intent. The very air became thick with spores that made his eyes water and his throat close. "Demeter!" he called out, his voice cracking with false bravado. "Surely we can negotiate like civilized." The floor beneath his feet exploded. Where marble had been, now there was only a chasm filled with writhing roots and grasping branches that reached for him with obvious hunger. Apollo spread his wings and launched himself through his window, bursting into the open air of Olympus. Demeter was waiting for him like an avenging fury. She stood on a throne of living wood that had erupted from the mountainside, her form terrible and magnificent. Her hair writhed like serpents, her eyes blazed with the accumulated fury of every ecological disaster in history, and around her, the very air pulsed with the power of nature unleashed. This wasn't the controlled goddess of harvest Apollo knew. This was Demeter as the embodiment of nature's wrath, terrible, implacable, and absolutely lethal. "You want to monetize the seasons?" she roared, her voice carrying the weight of avalanches. "Then face the full fury of the natural world." She gestured, and Mount Olympus itself became her weapon. Trees exploded from solid marble, their branches reaching for Apollo with predatory hunger. Vines shot through the air like living spears, seeking his divine flesh. The very ground beneath him turned into a writhing mass of roots and thorns that tried to drag him down into the earth's hungry embrace. Apollo dodged desperately, his divine reflexes barely keeping him ahead of the assault. But this wasn't a battle. This was an entire ecosystem trying to devour him. For every attack he avoided, 3 more took its place. "You're insane!" he screamed, using his shears to slice through a vine that had wrapped around his throat. "I'm offering them paradise." Paradise. Demeter's laugh was like the sound of forests dying. You're selling them their own survival. You've turned the breath of the earth into a commodity. The assault intensified beyond anything Apollo had imagined possible. The air itself became his enemy, thick with toxic pollen that burned his lungs, charged with spores that sought to take root in his divine flesh. The ground turned to quicksand made of fertile soil that hungered for his blood. Even the sunlight turned against him, focusing into burning beams that scorched his golden skin. And through it all, Apollo realized with growing terror that Demeter wasn't just trying to stop him. She was trying to kill him. Terror and rage warred in Apollo's chest as he dodged another killing blow. A massive oak tree erupted from the ground where he'd been standing, its branches sharp as spears, its roots hungry for divine blood. "We're family!" he screamed, desperation cracking his voice. "We're gods! We don't murder each other!" Family? Demeter's voice carried the weight of continental drift. You stopped being family when you decided to sell the earth's breath for gold. The assault reached a crescendo of fury. Every plant on Olympus turned against him. Every flower became a weapon. Every tree a soldier in Demeter's army. Apollo felt his divine strength beginning to fail, his reflexes slowing as exhaustion set in. And then something inside his mind snapped. Not sanity, he'd lost that long ago. Something deeper. The last restraint that had been holding back the full, terrible extent of his power. Apollo stopped running, stopped dodging, stopped trying to reason with the goddess who wanted him dead. He raised his shears high above his head, their silver blades catching the chaotic light of Demeter's assault. His eyes blazed with the fury of a god pushed beyond all limits. "You want to see what I'm truly capable of?" he screamed, his voice cracking with divine madness. "You want to know what happens when the god of seasons stops holding back?" He brought the shears down in a single, apocalyptic cut, and reality itself screamed. The cut tore through more than hair. It ripped a hole in the fabric of reality itself. Across the Mediterranean, the impossible became inevitable. In Egypt, winter and summer began alternating every heartbeat, creating hailstorms that turned to steam mid-fall. In Rome, autumn leaves fell upward while spring flowers bloomed downward, creating vertical storms of seasonal chaos. In Athens, all 4 seasons erupted simultaneously in different districts, turning the ancient city into a patchwork of meteorological madness. But it was on Olympus that the true horror unfolded. Apollo's desperate cut had shattered his control completely. Instead of commanding the seasons, he had become their slave. Every emotion that flickered through his divine consciousness translated instantly into weather patterns that defied all natural law. His rage became summer heat so intense it melted marble. His terror manifested as winter cold that froze the very air. His manic laughter triggered explosive spring growth that cracked the foundations of Olympus, while his growing despair brought autumn death that withered everything it touched. And through it all, Demeter's assault continued with relentless fury, turning the mountain of the gods into a battlefield where the fundamental forces of nature warred against each other. The other gods began to panic. Some fled to the far corners of the divine realm, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire between 2 deities who had clearly lost all reason. Others found themselves drawn into the conflict, choosing sides based on old alliances or personal grudges. Dionysus, god of wine and chaos, found the destruction amusing and began encouraging both combatants with drunken cheers. Athena tried desperately to mediate, but was driven back by a tornado made of rose petals and razor-sharp thorns. Even Aphrodite, normally above such crude conflicts, found herself forced to take shelter as the very air became charged with the fury of gods at war. Through the chaos, a silver arrow pierced the storm. Artemis materialized beside her brother, her divine form shimmering with protective light that held back the worst of the seasonal madness. She found Apollo hovering in the eye of his own hurricane, his shears clutched in trembling fists, his golden hair whipping around his face like liquid fire. "Apollo," she called out, her voice cutting through the roar of impossible weather. "Brother, you have to stop this. You're tearing reality apart." Apollo turned to look at her, and Artemis felt her immortal heart shatter at what she saw in his eyes. This wasn't the vain, charming brother she'd known for millennia. This was something broken, a god consumed by addiction, driven mad by power he could no longer control, trapped in a feedback loop of his own making. "I can't," he whispered, his voice somehow carrying despite the chaos around them. "Artemis, I can't stop it anymore. Every time I try to fix it, I make it worse. Every cut just... His voice broke completely, and for the first time in eons, Apollo began to weep. Divine tears that fell like liquid starlight, each drop creating new seasonal anomalies where it touched the ground. "I don't know how to stop," he sobbed. "I don't know how to go back to what I was before." And in that moment, watching her brother's complete breakdown, Artemis realized that the Apollo she'd known and loved might already be lost forever. The divine Salon wars had begun in earnest, and the only question now was whether there would be anything left to save when they finally ended. Chapter 7. The Mortal Rebellion. Thalia's hands had stopped shaking. For days, she had trembled with the earth's agony, every divine cut sending shockwaves through her mortal frame, every seasonal disruption making her convulse with sympathetic pain. But something had changed in the last few hours. The earth's voice, while still tortured, had begun to whisper something new. "Fight back." She sat in the ruins of her family's olive grove, surrounded by trees caught in seasonal madness. One ancient olive bore spring buds on its eastern branches, while autumn leaves fell from its western side. Ice crystals formed around summer fruit, creating impossible beauty that spoke of a world gone completely mad. But beneath the chaos, Thalia could feel something else, a deeper rhythm that the gods couldn't touch, couldn't corrupt, couldn't control. Around her, the survivors of 3 villages had gathered in desperate council. Farmers whose crops had been destroyed, shepherds whose flocks had died from confusion, merchants whose trade routes had become meaningless, all of them looking to the girl who had somehow survived the earth's screaming without losing her mind. "Tell us what to do," said Petros, the farmer who had once mocked her gift. His voice was hollow, broken. "The gods have gone mad, and we're dying for their madness." Thalia stood slowly, her legs unsteady, but her voice growing stronger with each word. "The gods haven't abandoned us," she said. "They've forgotten we exist. To them, we're just pieces on a game board, pawns in their divine tantrums." She pressed her palms against the tortured earth, feeling the confused pulse of plants that no longer knew when to grow, when to rest, when to die. But beneath that chaos, she felt something else. The deep, patient rhythm of the world itself, older than gods, stronger than divine madness. Apollo sells us seasons like a merchant sells grain, she continued, her voice carrying across the desperate crowd. Demeter wages war without caring who dies in the crossfire. They fight over the right to control us while we starve. Then what do we do? Asked Sophia, the village elder whose ancient wisdom seemed useless against divine insanity. How do mortals survive when the gods themselves have gone to war? Thalia looked around at the faces surrounding her. Farmers who had lost everything, shepherds whose flocks lay dead, merchants whose livelihoods had been destroyed by divine whim. In their eyes, she saw not just desperation, but something else. Something that made her heart race with possibility. Anger. We stop being their pawns, she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. We stop waiting for gods who treat our survival as entertainment. We create our own seasons. The silence that followed was deafening. For as long as mortals had existed, they had lived according to divine will. Spring came when Demeter allowed it. Summer blazed at Apollo's whim. Autumn arrived by celestial decree, and winter rested under godly authority. The thought of mortals creating their own seasonal calendar wasn't just revolutionary. It was the kind of blasphemy that got entire cities destroyed. But as Thalia looked around at the desperate faces surrounding her, she saw something that made her heart soar. They were listening. "You're talking about defying the gods," whispered Alexios, the grain merchant whose fortune had been destroyed by Apollo's experiments. "They'll kill us all." "They're already killing us," Thalia replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "The only difference is whether we die as slaves or as free people." She knelt and pressed her hands against the tortured earth, feeling for the rhythm that lay beneath the chaos. It was faint, almost overwhelmed by divine interference, but it was there, the slow, patient heartbeat of the world itself. "The earth remembers," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Beneath all the madness, the natural rhythms still exist. We just have to learn to listen to them directly, without waiting for gods to interpret them for us." "How?" demanded Demetrios, the shepherd whose flock had been decimated. "How do mortals read the earth when even the gods have lost control?" Thalia opened her eyes, and for the first time in days, she smiled. "We become scientists." The word hung in the air like a challenge to the gods themselves. Science, the radical idea that mortals could understand the natural world through observation and reason rather than divine revelation. "We watch the animals that haven't been driven mad," Thalia continued, her voice gaining momentum. "We observe which plants try to grow despite the chaos. We track the movement of stars that the gods cannot touch. We measure soil temperature, rainfall patterns, wind directions. We build our calendar from the pieces of nature that remember what they're supposed to be doing." "And when Apollo demands his tribute?" asked Demetrios, his voice tight with fear. "When he threatens to make our suffering worse if we don't pay?" Thalia stood, her small frame somehow radiating authority that made the crowd lean forward. "Then we tell him that mortals are no longer for sale." The words sent a ripple of shock through the gathering. To refuse a god's demand was to invite destruction. But as Thalia looked around at the desperate faces surrounding her, she saw something that gave her hope. They were nodding. Well, the rebellion spread like seeds on the wind. From village to village, port to port, the word traveled. Mortals were learning to read the earth for themselves. They called themselves the Earth Listeners, farmers who measured soil temperature with their bare hands, shepherds who tracked animal behavior with scientific precision, merchants who created new trade routes based on actual weather patterns rather than divine whims. In hidden gatherings, they shared their discoveries. A farmer from Crete had noticed that certain wildflowers bloomed according to daylight hours, not seasonal commands. A shepherd from Sparta had observed that his surviving sheep could predict weather changes days in advance. A merchant from Rhodes had mapped wind patterns that followed the moon's phases rather than godly moods. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to build something unprecedented. A calendar based on observation rather than worship. It was crude, full of gaps, and constantly in need of revision. But it was theirs. And more importantly, it worked. The first successful harvest using the Earth Listener's calendar happened in a small village outside Corinth. When the crops grew healthy and strong despite the seasonal chaos raging around them, word spread like wildfire. Mortals could survive without divine intervention. They could thrive. Apollo's rage shook the heavens. The first successful harvest had been like a slap to his divine face. Mortals, his mortals, had dared to prove they could survive without him. Worse, they were succeeding. I'm mortals! His voice boomed across the Mediterranean, his divine image appearing above every settlement where the rebellion had taken root. His beautiful face was twisted with fury, his golden hair whipping around him like flames. You dare to defy the God who controls your very survival? You think you can create seasons without my blessing? His laughter was beautiful and terrifying, like music played on instruments made of lightning and rage. You want to play at being gods? Very well. Let me remind you what happens when mortals forget their place. The punishment was immediate and devastating. In villages that had joined the rebellion, Apollo's power manifested as concentrated malice. Crops that had been carefully tended according to the new calendar withered in minutes, their roots turning to ash. Wells that had provided water for generations suddenly ran dry, their depths filled with sand. The very air became thick and oppressive, making it difficult to breathe. But the Earth Listeners had prepared for this moment. Scatter, Thalia commanded, her voice carrying across the network of rebels they had established. Take the knowledge underground. He can destroy our villages, but he cannot destroy what we've learned. The Earth Listeners melted away like morning mist. Farmers disguised their new planting schedules as traditional practices, hiding scientific observation behind the mask of ancient custom. Merchants coded their weather observations into seemingly innocent trade records, turning rebellion into commerce. Families taught their children the true calendar in whispered bedtime stories, passing down the revolutionary knowledge that mortals could survive without divine permission. They became a shadow network of resistance, connected by secret signs and coded messages. A certain way of arranging grain in the marketplace meant the soil temperature is rising. A particular knot in a fishing net indicated the birds are migrating early. Children's games became lessons in natural observation, their innocent play hiding the seeds of revolution. The gods might control the weather, but mortals controlled information. And information, Thalia realized, was a power that no amount of divine fury could destroy. On Mount Olympus, the divine Salon wars had become an apocalypse. Apollo's discovery of the mortal rebellion had shattered what remained of his sanity. His rage at their defiance manifested as heat so intense it turned marble to lava. His terror that they might actually succeed brought winter cold that froze divine blood in immortal veins. His desperate need to prove his relevance triggered explosive growth that cracked the very foundations of reality. But it was his fear that drove him to true madness, the growing, gnawing terror that mortals might not need gods at all. Demeter's assault had evolved beyond warfare into something approaching ecological apocalypse. Toxic algae blooms poisoned the divine air. Swarms of carnivorous insects devoured everything in their path. Fungal infections turned the mountain itself into a rotting mass of decay that pulsed with malevolent life. The other gods had long since chosen sides or fled entirely. Dionysus cheered on the destruction with manic glee, finding the chaos more intoxicating than wine. Athena had barricaded herself in her workshop, desperately trying to devise a solution that didn't involve the complete destruction of the natural order. Aphrodite had retreated to the far corners of the divine realm, unwilling to risk her beauty in a war between gods who had clearly lost all reason. Only Artemis remained in the eye of the storm, watching her brother's complete breakdown with growing horror. "Apollo," she pleaded, dodging a carnivorous vine that had tried to strangle her. "The mortals are dying. Can't you see what you're doing to them?" Apollo turned to her, his eyes blazing with divine madness, his hair whipping around his face like golden flames. "They defied me," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "They think they can survive without me. They think they can create their own seasons." "Maybe they can," Artemis said quietly. The words hit Apollo like a thunderbolt. He staggered backward, his shears trembling in his hands, his beautiful face contorting with rage and terror and something that might have been dawning comprehension. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "No, they need me. They need the gods. Without us, they're nothing. Without me, there are no seasons at all." But even as he spoke, Apollo could see the truth reflected in his sister's silver eyes. The mortals were adapting. They were learning. They were proving that survival didn't require divine permission, just observation, cooperation, and the courage to defy gods who had forgotten their purpose. And that terrified him more than anything Demeter could unleash. Because if mortals didn't need gods, what was the point of being divine at all? In her hidden camp in the mountains above Athens, Thalia felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. The earth's voice was still tortured, still chaotic, but beneath the divine madness she could sense something new, a rhythm that belonged to mortals rather than gods. The earth listeners had been working tirelessly, and their efforts were bearing fruit. They had discovered that certain plants bloomed according to soil temperature, rather than seasonal commands. That some animals migrated based on food availability rather than godly decree. That the deep currents of the earth followed patterns older than the Olympians themselves. Most importantly, they had learned to predict these patterns. "Look at this," she said to the small group of rebels gathered around her, holding up a carefully maintained scroll covered in observations and calculations. We can predict the next 3 days of weather with better accuracy than Apollo's chaos allows. The implications were staggering. If mortals could predict weather, they could plan crops, prepare for storms, organize their lives around natural rhythms rather than divine whims. What happens when Apollo realizes we're succeeding? Asked one of the younger farmers, his voice tight with fear. Thalia looked up at the sky, where the impossible weather patterns of the divine war painted the clouds in colors that had no names. Somewhere up there, gods were fighting over the right to control the seasons while mortals built their own future below. So then we show him that mortals are stronger than he thinks, she said, her voice ringing with quiet confidence. We show him that we don't need gods who treat our survival as entertainment. She pressed her hands against the earth one more time, feeling the deep pulse of a world that was learning to heal itself. The gods might control the weather, but mortals controlled knowledge. And knowledge, she had learned, was the most powerful force in any world. The rebellion wasn't just beginning anymore. It was succeeding. Or Chapter 8, the compromise attempt. Zeus stood in the ruins of his throne room and felt something he hadn't experienced in millennia: helplessness. He had survived the Titan War, weathered countless divine scandals, and managed to keep Olympus functioning despite the egos, rivalries, and romantic entanglements of his immortal family. But this was beyond anything in his experience. His mountain home was dying. The throne room, once a marvel of divine architecture, now resembled the aftermath of an apocalypse. Marble columns lay shattered by massive tree roots. The floor was a patchwork of ice, lava, and writhing vegetation that pulsed with malevolent life. The very air crackled with the unstable energy of seasons at war with themselves. And in the center of it all, his golden son Apollo hovered like a mad prophet, his shears clutched in white-knuckled fists, his beautiful face streaked with tears that had crystallized into tiny diamonds. Around him, reality itself bent and twisted to his emotional state. Summer heat that melted marble, winter cold that froze divine blood, spring growth that cracked the foundations of existence. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was the end of the natural order. Enough! Zeus's roar shook the foundations of existence itself. Lightning erupted from his form, not the controlled displays of power he usually favored, but raw, primal energy that spoke of a god pushed beyond all patience. The warring forces of nature, Apollo's chaotic seasons and Demeter's aggressive ecology, recoiled from the blast, like animals fleeing a forest fire. For the first time in days, Mount Olympus fell silent. Apollo spun toward his father, his eyes blazing with manic desperation. "Father, you have to understand. The mortals are defying me. They think they can survive without gods. They're building their own calendars, making their own seasons. If we let them succeed..." "I know exactly what they're doing," Zeus interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I've been watching their rebellion, and frankly, I'm beginning to think they have the right idea." The words hit Apollo like a thunderbolt. He staggered backward, his shears trembling in his hands, his face contorting with shock and betrayal. You're taking their side? Against your own son?" "I'm taking the side of sanity," Zeus replied, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Look around you, Apollo. Look at what your addiction has wrought. You've turned the natural order into a weapon, the seasons into a commodity, and the very foundations of reality into your personal grooming experiment. He gestured toward the devastation surrounding them. The mortals aren't rebelling against divine authority. They're rebelling against divine madness, and I can't say I blame them. Demeter emerged from the writhing mass of vegetation that had consumed half the throne room, her form terrible and magnificent. Vines and roots parted before her like a living carpet, and where she stepped, the chaotic growth settled into something resembling order. "Zeus," she said, her voice carrying the weight of continental drift. "This has gone beyond mediation. Apollo has proven he cannot be trusted with the power he's discovered. The only solution is to strip him of his connection to the seasons entirely." "You can't." Apollo's voice cracked with desperation. "The power is part of me now. Without it, I'm just another pretty god with a sun chariot." "Exactly," Demeter replied, her voice cold as winter frost. "And the world would be better for it." Apollo's face went white with shock. "You want to destroy me, both of you. You want to strip away everything that makes me special, everything that makes me powerful." "We want to save you," Zeus interrupted, his voice heavy with paternal pain. "From yourself, if necessary." He looked between his son and his sister, seeing the same stubborn determination in both their faces. Apollo, driven mad by addiction to power he couldn't control. Demeter, righteous in her fury but equally unwilling to bend. Both of them so focused on their conflict that they'd lost sight of the bigger picture. The mortals were succeeding without them. The Earth listeners were proving that divine intervention wasn't necessary for survival. If this continued, the gods themselves might become irrelevant. "There is another way," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of desperate hope. Both combatants turned to stare at him, their expressions ranging from hopeful to skeptical. "A schedule," Zeus continued, his voice taking on the tone he used for official pronouncements. "A carefully planned, rigorously maintained schedule for Apollos. Grooming activities, coordinated with Demeter's seasonal requirements, supervised by the full pantheon." The silence that followed was deafening. "A schedule," Apollo repeated slowly, as if the word were poison on his tongue. "For haircuts," Demeter added, her voice flat with disbelief. "You want to solve the greatest crisis in divine history with a grooming calendar." "Think about it," Zeus said, his voice gaining momentum as he warmed to his theme. "Apollo's power is clearly connected to his hair length and cutting patterns. If we can systematize it, control it, turn it into a predictable force rather than a chaotic one, we solve multiple problems at once." He began pacing, his mind racing through the possibilities. Apollo keeps his newfound abilities but within strict parameters. Demeter gets stable, predictable seasons. The mortals get the agricultural cycles they need. And most importantly, he paused, looking directly at both of them. "We prove that gods can still be relevant in a world where mortals are learning to think for themselves." He gestured, and the air filled with a shimmering diagram, a complex chart showing lunar cycles, seasonal transitions, and carefully timed intervals for divine grooming. Spring equinox, light trim to encourage new growth. Summer solstice. Styling and shaping for maximum solar power. Autumn equinox. Moderate cut to begin the harvest cycle. Winter solstice. Deep conditioning and rest period. Apollo stared at the chart, his manic energy shifting into something approaching scientific fascination. It's actually quite elegant. A systematic approach to seasonal control. I could perfect the technique, refine the timing, maybe even develop specialized cuts for different agricultural needs. His eyes began to glow with renewed obsession. Think of the possibilities. Precision cuts for grape harvests, layered styling for grain cycles, seasonal highlights for fruit trees. Absolutely not, Demeter interrupted, her voice sharp as breaking stone. You're talking about turning the fundamental forces of nature into an elaborate beauty routine. A carefully planned beauty routine, Zeus corrected, shooting his sister a warning look. With divine oversight and mortal input, we could establish a council, representatives from the farming communities, advisors from the merchant guilds, experts in agricultural timing. The mortals would never agree to it, Demeter protested. They're already rebelling against divine control of the seasons. Why would they accept an even more elaborate system of divine grooming schedules? Zeus's expression grew serious. Because we'll give them what they want most. Predictability and partnership. No more chaos, no more divine tantrums affecting their crops. Just reliable, scheduled seasonal transitions that they can plan around. And more importantly, he paused for emphasis. We'll acknowledge their expertise. The Earth listeners have proven they understand natural cycles. We need their knowledge as much as they need our power. Apollo was already nodding enthusiastically, his manic energy redirecting itself toward this new possibility. We could publish the schedule, distribute it to every farming community in the Mediterranean. They'd know exactly when each seasonal transition would occur, down to the hour. And if you deviate from the schedule? Demeter asked pointedly. Apollo's enthusiasm faltered, his hands moving instinctively to protect his shears. Well, I suppose there would have to be consequences. Severe consequences, Zeus added, his voice carrying the weight of divine law. Binding oaths that cannot be broken. Automatic penalties for unauthorized grooming. Complete suspension of your solar duties for any violation. The threat of losing his sun chariot seemed to penetrate Apollo's manic haze like a cold blade. He clutched his shears protectively, his beautiful face cycling through panic, calculation, and something that might have been genuine fear. You would really do that? He whispered. You would take away my chariot, my purpose, to save you from yourself? Zeus's voice was heavy with paternal pain. Yes, without hesitation. Apollo stared at his father for a long moment, then at his shears, then at the devastation surrounding them. For the first time since discovering his power, he seemed to truly see the consequences of his actions. It could work, he said finally, his voice small and uncertain. If the schedule were detailed enough, precise enough. Maybe I could learn to work within it. Channel my power constructively rather than destructively. Demeter looked between father and son, her expression cycling through disbelief, consideration, and reluctant hope. you're serious about this. You actually think we can turn Apollo's addiction into a functional system. Addiction is just misdirected passion, Zeus replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Channel it properly, and it becomes manageable. For a moment, the three gods stood in the ruins of the throne room, contemplating the possibility of turning divine madness into divine order. Around them, the chaotic growth began to settle, as if the very plants were holding their breath. There would have to be safeguards, Demeter said finally. Multiple layers of oversight. Backup plans for when, not if, Apollo's vanity overrides his judgment. Agreed. Zeus nodded. And the mortals would have to be consulted. Their Earth listeners have proven they understand natural cycles better than we gave them credit for. We could learn from their observations. Apollo's face brightened at the mention of the mortal rebels, his manic energy returning in full force. Yes, they could help refine the schedule. Their data could inform my cutting patterns. It would be a collaboration between divine power and mortal wisdom. The irony was not lost on any of them. Apollo, who had spent days trying to destroy the mortal rebellion, was now eager to work with them. But Zeus noticed something else in his son's expression, a calculating gleam that suggested Apollo was already planning how to manipulate this new system to his advantage. Very well, Zeus declared, his voice taking on the weight of divine law. We will attempt this compromise, a scheduled, supervised, collaborative approach to seasonal management. Apollo will submit to oversight, Demeter will provide guidance, and the mortals will contribute their knowledge. He paused, looking directly at his son with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. But understand this, Apollo, this is your last chance. If this system fails, if your addiction overrides your judgment even once, the consequences will be permanent and irreversible. Apollo nodded eagerly, but Zeus could see the wheels turning behind his golden eyes. Already, his son was lost in visions of perfectly timed cuts and precisely controlled seasons, and ways to bend the rules without technically breaking them. It won't fail, Father, Apollo said, his voice ringing with false sincerity. I'll make it work. I'll prove that divine power and mortal wisdom can coexist. Demeter remained skeptical, her expression suggesting she could see right through Apollo's performance. For the sake of the natural order, I'll try. But I want it on record that I think this is a terrible idea that will end in disaster. Unnoted, Zeus replied, though privately he was beginning to share her concerns. Now, shall we begin drafting the divine seasonal schedule? As the three gods began to work out the details of their unprecedented compromise, none of them noticed the small scrying pool in the corner of the ruined throne room, and none of them saw the image it displayed. Apollo's reflection, beautiful and terrible, smiling with the secret knowledge that schedules, like rules, were made to be broken. The compromise was about to begin, but Apollo's addiction was far from cured. On Chapter 9, the hair crisis. The divine seasonal schedule lasted exactly 3 days, 4 hours, and 17 minutes. For those precious 76 hours, the world held its breath in hope. Apollo had submitted to his first scheduled trim with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm, carefully following the precise measurements outlined in the new system. Spring had arrived across the Mediterranean with clockwork precision, gentle warmth that kissed the earth awake, perfectly timed rainfall that made farmers fall to their knees in gratitude. In her mountain hideout, Thalia had felt the earth's voice settle into something approaching peace for the first time in weeks. The tortured screaming had faded to whispers, then to the natural murmur of soil and root and growing things. She had even dared to hope. The earth listeners had been cautiously optimistic. Thalia herself had traveled to a neutral meeting ground to consult on the schedule, her expertise in natural rhythms proving invaluable in fine-tuning the divine grooming calendar. For the first time since the crisis began, mortals and gods seemed to be working together toward a common goal. But Apollo's addiction had simply been biding its time, coiled like a serpent in his divine soul, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It started with a lie, Apollo told himself. Just a tiny trim, he murmured to his reflection on the morning of the fourth day, his hands trembling as they reached for his shears. The left side is slightly longer than the right. Barely noticeable, really, but if I'm going to represent divine perfection. The addiction whispered its seductive promises. Just one cut. So small, no one will notice. You deserve to look perfect. The shears whispered through a few strands of golden hair, and Apollo's entire being exploded with euphoria. The rush of power was even more intense than before, as if the brief abstinence had made his divine essence more sensitive to the drug of seasonal control. "Oh," he gasped, his knees nearly buckling from the intensity. "Oh, that's incredible." But the earth screamed. Across Greece, the carefully calibrated spring weather convulsed. Temperatures spiked by exactly 3 degrees in minutes. Rainfall patterns shifted with violent suddenness. Flowers that had been blooming in perfect sequence suddenly accelerated their cycles, their petals falling like snow as they burned through their life cycles in hours instead of days. In her mountain hideout, Thalia doubled over as if she'd been stabbed. The earth's voice, which had finally begun to whisper peace, suddenly shrieked with renewed agony. "No!" she gasped, blood trickling from her nose. "No! No! No! He's cutting again! The schedule! He's already breaking it." But Apollo, drunk on divine euphoria, spun elaborate justifications for his relapse. Such a minor deviation didn't really count. The schedule was still intact. He was still following the rules. This was just maintenance. The next day, he woke to find his hair noticeably longer. Not the gradual growth of mortal hair, but something accelerated and hungry. His divine essence, having tasted the forbidden fruit of unscheduled cutting, was now demanding more. Probably a side effect of the new system, he reasoned, his hands already reaching for his shears. Nothing that couldn't be managed with another small adjustment. Snip. The second cut was deeper, more desperate. Apollo's entire body convulsed with pleasure as the power flooded through him, more intense than any drug, more addictive than any mortal vice. This time, the disruption was catastrophic. Summer heat began bleeding into the spring weather patterns like poison in a wound. Crops that had been growing steadily suddenly experienced violent growth spurts that left farmers watching in horror as their carefully tended fields exploded into chaos. On Mount Olympus, Demeter felt the disturbance and immediately stormed to Apollo's chambers. "You're cutting again," she accused, her eyes blazing with green fire. "I can feel it in every plant, every grain of soil. You promised to follow the schedule. Apollo looked up from his mirror, his pupils dilated with the afterglow of his latest fix. Golden hair clippings littered the floor around him like evidence of a crime. "I am following the schedule," he protested, his voice high and defensive. "These are just minor adjustments, tiny corrections to maintain optimal appearance. Surely you don't expect me to look unkempt." "I expect you to keep your word," Demeter snarled, her power making the marble floor crack beneath her feet. "The schedule allows for grooming every 3 months. It's been 3 days." "The schedule," Apollo said with the careful precision of an addict who had spent sleepless hours finding loopholes, "specifies major cuts every 3 months. It says nothing about minor maintenance between scheduled sessions." Demeter stared at him in disbelief and growing horror. "You're parsing the language like a lawyer, like a mortal trying to cheat on a contract." "I'm interpreting the agreement like a responsible god," Apollo replied, but his hands were shaking now, his divine essence already craving the next cut. "The mortals want predictable seasons, and I'm giving them predictable seasons. These tiny adjustments actually improve the system's precision." Even as he spoke, Demeter could see the lie in his eyes. This wasn't about precision or responsibility. This was about feeding an addiction that had grown beyond all reason. Over the following days, Apollo's hair began to grow with supernatural speed. Not the normal, gradual growth of mortal hair, but something hungry and demanding, as if his divine essence, having tasted the forbidden fruit of unscheduled cutting, was now punishing him with accelerated growth that demanded more frequent fixes. By the end of the week, Apollo's hair had grown to his shoulders. By the end of the second week, it reached his waist. And with each passing hour, his need to cut it grew stronger, more desperate, more consuming. "It's not natural," he complained to Artemis, who had taken to visiting him daily out of sisterly concern. His hands shook as he spoke, his eyes darting constantly to his shears. "Hair shouldn't grow this fast. Something's wrong with the system." Artemis looked at her brother with growing alarm. His golden locks, once perfectly styled, now hung around him like a shimmering prison. He looked magnificent and terrible, like a god of wild nature rather than civilized beauty. But more than that, he looked sick, the hollow-eyed, trembling sickness of an addict in withdrawal. "Maybe," she said gently, "your body is trying to tell you something. Maybe the power wants to be used more than the schedule allows." "That's ridiculous," Apollo protested, but his hands were already moving toward his shears with the desperate hunger of a starving man reaching for bread. "I can control it. I just need to manage the growth rate. A few strategic cuts to slow down the process." "Apollo, no!" But it was too late. Apollo's shears flashed through his hair in a frenzied cutting spree, each snip sending him into paroxysms of divine ecstasy. His entire body convulsed with pleasure as the power flooded through him, more intense than ever before. The effect on the natural world was apocalyptic. Spring weather gave way to summer heat, which immediately shifted to autumn cooling, which then plunged into winter cold, all within the span of heartbeats. The very air screamed as the seasons tore themselves apart. Across the Mediterranean, mortals fled their homes as reality itself went to war. Crops withered and bloomed and died and grew again in endless, impossible cycles. Animals collapsed in confusion as their instincts were shattered by weather that changed faster than thought. Children cried as snow fell on blooming flowers, as ice formed on fruit trees heavy with summer harvest. And Apollo's hair kept growing. "I don't understand," he gasped, staring at his reflection in horror. Even as he watched, his hair lengthened before his eyes, growing at a rate that defied all natural law. Each cut seemed to make it grow faster, hungrier, more demanding. "I cut it, but it just keeps growing faster." Artemis backed away from her brother, her face pale with dawning comprehension. "Apollo, I think you've created a feedback loop. The more you cut, the faster it grows. The faster it grows, the more you need to cut it. You're trapped in your own addiction." Apollo's eyes went wide with panic. He raised his shears again, but Artemis caught his wrist with desperate strength. "Stop," she pleaded. "You're making it worse." "I can't stop." Apollo's voice cracked with the desperation of a drowning man. "Look at it. It's growing so fast I can barely see. If I don't cut it, it'll... He trailed off, staring at his reflection with dawning horror. His hair now reached the floor, a cascade of golden silk that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. And with each inch it grew. He could feel the seasons becoming more unstable, more chaotic, more hungry for release. The addiction had evolved beyond his control. It was no longer just about the rush of power. It was about survival. His divine essence was trapped in a cycle of its own making, growing and demanding and consuming until there was nothing left but need. "Oh, what happens if I never cut it again?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own terror. The question hung in the air like a death sentence, because they both knew the answer. If Apollo's hair continued to grow unchecked, if the power continued to build without release, the seasons wouldn't just become chaotic, they would stop entirely. The world would be locked in whatever season his hair length dictated, frozen in time until the end of existence. "You have to find a way to break the cycle," Artemis said urgently, "before it's too late." But Apollo was no longer listening. He was staring at his reflection with the wild eyes of a god who had finally realized the true scope of his addiction. His hair continued to grow, inch by impossible inch, and with each moment that passed, the world outside grew colder. Winter was coming, and if Apollo couldn't find a way to control his power, it would never end. Then something shifted in Apollo's expression. The panic faded, replaced by something far more terrifying, a cold, calculating madness. "Maybe," he whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying the weight of divine judgment. "Maybe that's what the world deserves. Maybe if I never cut my hair again, if I let winter freeze everything solid, then no one will have to worry about seasons anymore." Artemis felt her immortal blood turn to ice. "Apollo, you can't mean that." But Apollo's smile was beautiful and terrible and completely insane. The smile of a god who had found the ultimate solution to his problem. If he couldn't control his addiction, he would use it as a weapon. "Can't I?" His voice grew stronger, more confident, drunk on the power of ultimate destruction. "The mortals want to rebel against divine authority? Fine. Let them try to grow crops in eternal winter. Let them try to survive without seasons at all. Let them learn what happens when they defy the gods. His hair reached his ankles now, a golden waterfall that seemed to drink in the light around it, growing longer with each breath. And outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, in the middle of what should have been spring. The hair crisis had become something far worse than addiction. It had become divine terrorism. And Apollo, driven mad by his own compulsions, was about to hold the entire world hostage to his vanity. The only question was whether anyone could stop him before winter claimed everything forever. Chapter 10. The Mortal's Wisdom. The snow was falling upward. Thalia stood in what had once been her family's olive grove, watching crystalline flakes drift toward the sky like the tears of a dying world. Each snowflake caught the strange light of a sun that couldn't decide whether to shine or hide, creating a cascade of diamonds that mocked the frozen fruit hanging from winter-bare branches. The olives themselves had become grotesque ornaments, summer flesh wrapped in winter ice, pulsing with the confused heartbeat of seasons at war. For 3 days, the eternal winter had been spreading across the Mediterranean like a plague of divine madness. The cold wasn't natural. It carried the bitter taste of godly despair, the sharp edge of immortal fear. It seeped into bones and souls alike, freezing not just flesh, but hope itself. Crops that had survived the earlier chaos now withered in crystalline death. Animals lay in huddled masses, their breath forming clouds that froze and shattered before touching the ground. Children no longer cried for spring. They had forgotten what warmth felt like. And through it all, Thalia felt the earth dying. The voice that had been her constant companion, sometimes whisper, sometimes scream, always true, was fading to a silence more terrible than any sound. Not the peaceful quiet of natural rest, but the hollow stillness of a heart stopping. The soil beneath her feet was freezing solid, its life force retreating deeper and deeper until soon there would be nothing left but stone and memory. He's going to kill everything, she whispered to the handful of Earth listeners who had gathered around her. They were the last of the rebellion. Marcus with his frost-blackened hands, Elena whose herb gardens had become sculptures of ice, old Demetrios whose sheep lay frozen in the fields like white stones. The survivors who had refused to flee to warmer lands that no longer existed anywhere on Earth. What can we do? Marcus's voice cracked like breaking ice. His wheat fields had been among the first to succumb to the eternal winter, and the loss had aged him a decade in 3 days. We're mortals. How do we fight a god who's lost his mind? Thalia pressed her hands against the frozen earth, feeling for any trace of the deep rhythm that had once guided her people. It was still there, faint as a dying breath, buried beneath layers of divine madness, but growing weaker with each passing hour. Soon, even that ancient pulse would fade to nothing. We don't fight him, she said finally, the words surprising even her. We save him. The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief and something that might have been horror. Save him. Marcus's voice cracked with bitter laughter. He's holding the entire world hostage. He's threatening to freeze us all to death because we dared to think for ourselves. Elena's weathered face was grim. The god who destroyed my life's work, who turned my healing herbs into monuments of ice. You want to save him? Because he's terrified, Thalia said, her voice growing stronger as understanding crystallized like frost in her mind. Think about it. We proved that mortals don't need gods to survive. We created our own calendar, our own understanding of the natural world. For the first time in his existence, Apollo faced the possibility that he might be irrelevant. But even as she spoke, Thalia felt the earth's voice whispering a truth that made her heart ache. Apollo wasn't evil. He was sick, broken, trapped in a cycle of power and fear that was destroying him as surely as it was destroying the world. And sick things could be healed if someone cared enough to try. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, but her voice growing stronger with each word. Around her, the Earth listeners watched with the desperate attention of people who had run out of hope and were willing to grasp at anything, even madness. He's not holding us hostage because he's evil, she continued. He's doing it because he's desperate. Because if mortals don't need gods, then what's the point of being divine at all? Demetrios, the old shepherd, shook his head slowly. You're talking about a god, child, not some village boy having a tantrum. Apollo could unmake us with a thought. Could he? Thalia asked, and there was something in her voice that made them all lean closer. If he could simply destroy us, why the elaborate threats? Why the eternal winter instead of just ending us? He needs us to need him. That's what this is really about. The Earth listeners stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. But Thalia could feel the truth of it in her bones, in the fading voice of the Earth itself. Apollo's addiction wasn't just about power. It was about purpose, about mattering, about being needed. So what do you propose? Elena's voice was carefully neutral, but Thalia could hear the desperate hope underneath. That we march up to Mount Olympus and give him a hug. Something like that, Thalia said, and she wasn't entirely joking. Someone needs to talk to him, really talk to him. Not as a subject to a god, not as a rebel to a tyrant, but as one person to another. Someone needs to help him understand what he's really destroying. And you think that someone is you? Marcus asked. Thalia looked around at the frozen wasteland that had once been fertile farmland, at the faces of people who had lost everything to divine madness, at the sky where snow fell upward in defiance of all natural law. I'm the only one who can hear what the earth is really saying, she said quietly. And right now, it's saying that Apollo is as much a victim of this as we are. He's trapped in a cycle he can't break, destroying the very thing he was meant to protect. She paused, feeling the weight of what she was about to propose. I'm going to Mount Olympus, she announced. I'm going to find Apollo, and I'm going to try to save him from himself. The silence that followed was deafening. That's suicide, Elena said flatly. Gods don't listen to mortals, especially not gods who have gone completely mad. Maybe, Thalia admitted. But what's the alternative? We sit here and freeze to death while the world dies around us? We wait for other gods to fix a problem they don't understand. She knelt and pressed her hands against the frozen earth one more time, feeling for the deep pulse that connected all living things. It was barely there now, a whisper of what it had once been, but it was enough. The earth is dying, she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Not just sleeping, not just resting, dying. If Apollo doesn't break this cycle soon, there won't be anything left to save. She stood and looked each of her companions in the eye. I know it sounds impossible. I know it sounds insane, but I have to try. Because if we don't, then everything we've worked for, everything we've learned about the natural world, everything we've discovered about our own strength, dies with us. Marcus was the first to nod. What do you need? Time, Thalia said, and a way to reach Mount Olympus without freezing to death on the way. The old shepherd paths, Elena suggested. They're treacherous, but they lead up the mountain. If you can survive the climb. I'll survive, Thalia said with more confidence than she felt. I have to. As the Earth listeners began planning her impossible journey, Thalia felt something she hadn't experienced in days. Hope. Not the desperate hope of the dying, but the quiet confidence of someone who had finally understood their purpose. She was going to save a god, not because he deserved it, but because the world needed him to be better than he was. And maybe, just maybe, because everyone, even immortal beings drunk on their own power, deserved a chance at redemption. The journey to Mount Olympus took 2 days through a landscape that had forgotten the meaning of natural law. Thalia walked through forests where autumn leaves fell upward like prayers to a deaf sky, while snow drifted down in defiance of gravity and season alike. The trees themselves seemed confused, oak branches bearing cherry blossoms while their roots pushed through soil that alternated between summer drought and winter permafrost with each step she took. She passed lakes that were frozen solid on the surface but boiling underneath, their ice cracking and reforming in patterns that hurt to look at. Steam rose through the cracks, carrying the scent of flowers that had never existed and the sound of music that made her teeth ache. In one valley, summer flowers bloomed in winter soil that should have been too hard to support life, their petals falling upward to join the confused snow. The closer she got to the divine realm, the more reality itself seemed to fray at the edges. Apollo's hair was still growing. She could feel it in the increasing chaos, in the way the very air seemed to pulse with unstable power. Each inch it lengthened made his control more erratic, more dangerous. The world was becoming a reflection of a god's breakdown, and she was walking directly into the heart of the madness. By the time she reached the base of Mount Olympus itself, Thalia was exhausted, frost-bitten, and running on nothing but determination and the fading voice of the earth. Her lips were blue with cold, her hands numb despite the strange pockets of summer heat she'd walked through. But she was alive, and that was more than many could say. The mountain rose before her like a pillar of impossible light, its peak wreathed in clouds that shifted between snow and rain and lightning with each passing moment. Somewhere up there, a god was having a breakdown that threatened to destroy the world. And somehow, she was going to fix it. The climb was treacherous beyond mortal comprehension. The very air around Mount Olympus crackled with divine energy gone wild, thick as honey and sharp as broken glass. More than once, Thalia found herself walking through pockets of reality where the laws of physics had simply given up in despair. She passed through a grove where trees grew downward into the sky, their roots reaching toward stars that flickered like dying candles. She crossed a stream that flowed in all directions at once, its water singing lamentations in languages that predated human speech. She climbed stairs carved from crystallized music that sang mournful songs as she stepped on them, each note a memory of harmony now lost. The higher she climbed, the more the mountain itself seemed to weep. divine marble cracked under the pressure of seasons at war. Golden pathways tarnished and twisted. The very stones beneath her feet pulsed with the erratic heartbeat of a god in crisis. But the earth's voice, faint as it was, guided her upward. Even here, in the realm of the gods, the deep rhythm of the natural world persisted. It was wounded, confused, dying, but it was still there, still calling to her, still believing that healing was possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of climbing through impossible geography, Thalia reached the plateau where the gods made their home. What she found there made her stop in her tracks, her heart breaking for reasons she couldn't name. Mount Olympus was dying. The marble palaces were cracked and crumbling, their perfect facades marred by the aggressive growth of plants that couldn't decide what season they were supposed to be experiencing. Ice covered everything, but it was ice that bloomed with impossible flowers, ice that grew leaves, ice that pulsed with the confused heartbeat of nature gone mad. And in the center of it all, visible through the shattered walls of what had once been a magnificent palace, sat Apollo. He was barely recognizable as the golden god of legend. His hair had grown to impossible lengths, a cascade of gold that pooled around him like liquid sunlight, stretching across the marble floor and spilling out through broken windows like the train of a wedding dress made from light itself. But there was nothing beautiful about it now. The divine locks had become chains, binding him to the floor, wrapping around his wrists and ankles, growing faster than he could move. His beautiful face was gaunt with exhaustion, his perfect features hollow with the kind of weariness that came from fighting a battle that couldn't be won. His eyes, once bright as the sun itself, were wild with the madness of someone who had been awake for days, trapped in a cycle of his own making, watching his power destroy everything he had ever claimed to protect. He was talking to himself, his voice a constant stream of justifications and rationalizations and desperate attempts to make sense of what he had become. The words tumbled over each other like water over stones, beautiful and meaningless and heartbreaking. They don't understand, he was saying, his hands moving restlessly through his hair, each touch making it grow longer, making the trap more complete. They think they can survive without gods, but look what happens when gods stop caring. Look what happens when we let them make their own rules. Look what happens when we're not. When we're not. His voice broke, and for a moment, the terrible beauty of his madness cracked to reveal something infinitely more human underneath. Thalia took a deep breath and stepped into the ruined palace. Her footsteps echoed strangely in the vast space, each sound multiplied and distorted by the chaotic acoustics of a divine realm in collapse. "Hello, Apollo," she said quietly. The god's head snapped up, his wild eyes focusing on her with difficulty. For a moment, he seemed confused, as if he couldn't quite process the sight of a mortal in his divine sanctuary. His hair continued to grow around him, each strand catching the strange light and casting shadows that moved independently of their source. "You," he whispered, his voice hoarse from days of talking to himself. "You're the one who started all this, the one who taught them to rebel, the one who made them think they could survive without." He trailed off, his eyes losing focus again, as if the effort of maintaining a conversation was almost beyond him. "Yes," Thalia said simply, settling down on the cold marble floor as if she were visiting a sick friend rather than confronting a mad god. "I am." Apollo's expression shifted through a dozen emotions, Rage, fear, confusion, something that might have been relief. His hands moved restlessly through his hair, and with each touch, the golden strands grew longer, more tangled, more impossible. "Have you come to gloat?" he asked, his voice cracking like a child's. "To see what your rebellion has wrought? To watch a god destroy himself?" "No," Thalia said, her voice gentle but firm. "I've come to help." Apollo stared at her for a long moment, then threw back his head and laughed. It was a terrible sound, beautiful and broken and completely mad, like the song of a nightingale with its throat cut. The laughter echoed through the ruined palace, multiplying until it sounded like a chorus of broken gods. "To help?" He gasped between fits of laughter, his hair growing longer with each convulsion. "Help me. I am a god. I control the very seasons. I hold the power of life and death over every growing thing in the world." "And you're miserable," Thalia said quietly. The laughter stopped as if she had slapped him. The sudden silence was deafening. "You're trapped in a cycle you can't break," she continued, her voice gentle but firm. "You're destroying the very thing you were meant to protect. And you're doing it because you're terrified that if you stop, if you let go of this power, you'll discover that you don't matter anymore." Apollo's face went through a series of expressions: denial, anger, and finally, something that looked almost like recognition. His hands stilled in his hair for the first time in days. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his hair growing. "You can't understand. You're mortal. You don't know what it's like to face eternity knowing that you might be unnecessary." "You're right," Thalia said, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "I don't understand what it's like to be immortal, but I do understand what it's like to feel useless." She gestured toward the chaos surrounding them, the ice that bloomed with impossible flowers, the marble that cracked under the weight of confused seasons, the very air that shimmered with unstable power. "Do you know what I was before all this started? A farmer's daughter who talked to dirt. People thought I was touched in the head. They humored me because I was harmless, but they didn't really believe that I could hear what the earth was saying." Apollo was listening now, his wild eyes fixed on her face with the desperate attention of someone who had been drowning and suddenly glimpsed the possibility of rescue. Then the chaos started. Thalia continued, her voice growing stronger. "And suddenly, my strange gift was the only thing standing between my people and starvation. For the first time in my life, I mattered. I was important. I was needed." She paused, watching as understanding began to dawn in his divine features. "And you know what I discovered? Being needed isn't the same as being useful. Being important isn't the same as being helpful. The earth doesn't need me to interpret its voice. It's been speaking just fine for millions of years without my help. But I can choose to listen. I can choose to help others understand. I can choose to be part of something bigger than myself." Apollo's hair continued to grow around them, but his hands had stopped their restless movement. For the first time in days, he was truly still, truly listening. "You want to matter," Thalia said gently. "You want to be necessary, but you're trying to make yourself necessary by holding the world hostage. That's not purpose. That's tyranny." "Then what is purpose?" Apollo asked, his voice barely a whisper, fragile as spun glass. Thalia smiled, and for the first time in days, it was a genuine expression of hope. Around them, the chaos seemed to pause, as if the very air was holding its breath. "Let me show you," she said. And slowly, carefully, with the patience of someone who understood that healing took time, she began to teach a god what it really meant to serve the natural world. Chapter 11. The New System. The first thing Thalia taught Apollo was how to listen. They sat together in the ruins of his palace, surrounded by the chaos of seasons at war. Ice that bloomed with impossible roses, marble that cracked under the weight of summer vines growing in winter air, the very stones beneath them pulsing with the erratic heartbeat of divine madness. Apollo's hair continued to grow in restless spirals around them, each strand catching the strange light and casting shadows that moved independently of their source. "I can't," he whispered, his voice breaking with frustration as he pressed his palms against the fractured floor. "There's too much noise, too much chaos, too much me." His hands trembled against the marble, and where he touched, frost spread in delicate patterns that immediately melted under bursts of unseasonable heat. The contradiction of it, beauty and destruction in the same gesture, made Thalia's heart ache. "Well, that's exactly the problem," she said gently, placing her own hands over his. "You've been listening to your own power for so long, you've forgotten how to hear anything else. But the Earth's voice is still there, Apollo. It's always been there, waiting for you to remember how to be quiet enough to hear it." "Close your eyes," she whispered. "Feel deeper, past the chaos, past the fear, past the need to control everything. Listen for the rhythm that was here before gods, before mortals, before anything but stone and water and the slow dance of time." Apollo's breathing slowed. His hair stopped growing. The chaotic energy around them seemed to pause, as if the very air was holding its breath. And in that brief, precious stillness, he heard it, faint as a whisper, patient as stone, ancient as the world itself. The Earth's heartbeat. It was nothing like his own divine power, not bright or demanding or impossible to ignore. It was quiet, steady, eternal. The rhythm of seasons that had turned for millions of years before he was born, that would continue turning long after the last god faded from memory. I can hear it," he breathed, wonder replacing the madness in his eyes. Tears began to fall, each one freezing and melting before it hit the ground. "It's so quiet, so steady. How did I never notice it before?" "Because you were too busy trying to make it louder," Thalia said, her voice soft with understanding. "But that's not how it works. The Earth doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't need to prove its importance. It just is, and it's been waiting for you to remember how to listen." Apollo's hands trembled against the floor. "I've been so afraid," he whispered. "So afraid that without my power, without controlling everything, I would be nothing." "You're not nothing," Thalia said firmly. "You're Apollo, god of music, of prophecy, of healing. You're the sun itself, but you're also part of something bigger than yourself. And that's not a weakness. That's where your real strength comes from. Around them, the chaos began to settle. Not disappearing, that would take time, but becoming less frantic, less desperate. The ice flowers still bloomed impossibly, but their growth slowed to something almost natural. The confused seasons still warred, but their battle became less violent, more like a dance. "What do I do?" Apollo asked, his voice small and lost. "How do I fix what I've broken?" Thalia smiled. "We start small, we start simple, and we ask for help." Demeter arrived at Mount Olympus like a storm front, inevitable, powerful, and carrying the scent of rain on fertile soil. Thalia felt her coming before she saw her, a presence that made the earth beneath the palace sing with recognition. The chaotic vegetation that had been writhing in seasonal confusion suddenly stilled, as if every plant, every flower, every blade of grass was turning towards something they had been waiting for. When the goddess of harvest finally appeared in the ruined throne room, she was magnificent and terrible. Her form seemed to shift between seasons, now the green abundance of summer, now the golden richness of autumn, now the stark beauty of winter, now the tender hope of spring. Where she stepped, the confused plants parted like a living sea, not in fear, but in reverence. But it was her eyes that made Thalia's breath catch. Ancient eyes, older than civilization, that had watched the first seeds take root in primordial soil. Eyes that held the memory of every harvest, every famine, every season that had ever turned. And in those eyes, Thalia saw something she hadn't expected: pain. Demeter stopped when she saw Apollo and Thalia sitting together on the marble floor, the god's impossible hair finally still, his hands pressed against the earth in an attitude of listening rather than commanding. For a long moment, she simply stared, her expression cycling through surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been hope. "Well," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of mountains and the patience of growing things. "This is unexpected." Apollo looked up at his sister, and for the first time in days, his eyes were clear. "Demeter, His voice broke. "I need to apologize. For everything. For the chaos, for the fighting, for treating the seasons like they were mine to control. For forgetting that you've been protecting the harvest for millennia while I played with my hair like a child with a new toy." Demeter studied him for a long moment, her expression cycling through emotions too complex for mortal understanding. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "You look terrible." "I feel terrible," Apollo admitted, his hands still pressed against the earth. "I've been terrible. I nearly destroyed everything, the crops, the people, the natural order itself. And for what? Because I was afraid of being irrelevant?" "You were always irrelevant to the harvest," Demeter said, and her words cut like winter wind. "Until you made yourself relevant through destruction." Apollo flinched as if she had struck him, but he didn't look away. "You're right. I was so desperate to matter that I broke everything that actually did matter." For a moment, the ancient pain in Demeter's eyes flickered into something softer. "You were my little brother once," she said quietly. "Before the power, before the vanity, before you forgot that being a god means serving something greater than yourself. I remember when you used to ask me about the growing things, when you wanted to understand how life worked instead of just commanding it. I remember too, Apollo whispered. I remember when your approval meant more to me than all the worship in the world. That's why I'm here, Thalia said, standing slowly and feeling the weight of the moment. To help you both remember what you've forgotten. To help you figure out how to work together instead of against each other. Demeter's gaze shifted to the mortal woman, and Thalia felt the full weight of divine attention. Not hostile, but measuring, evaluating, trying to understand how a farmer's daughter had managed to reach a mad god when all of Olympus had failed. You're the Earth listener, Demeter said. It wasn't a question, but there was something like respect in her voice. I'm Thalia, she replied simply, and I think I might have an idea that could heal more than just the seasons. The idea was both simple and revolutionary. Cooperation. But as Thalia began to explain it, she realized that simple didn't mean easy. The problem, she said, choosing her words carefully as they sat in what had once been Apollo's throne room, isn't that Apollo discovered he could control seasons through his hair? The problem is that he tried to do it alone. She gestured toward the chaos surrounding them, the ice that bloomed with impossible flowers, the marble that cracked under the pressure of confused growth, the very air that still shimmered with unstable power like heat waves over summer stone. Look at this mess. This is what happens when one god tries to manage something that requires balance. Apollo, you're incredibly powerful, but you're not the only force that affects growing things. The sun matters, yes, but so does soil composition, rainfall patterns, temperature fluctuations, the phases of the moon. Apollo's hair stirred restlessly around him. Are you saying I'm not important? I'm saying you're not everything, Thalia replied gently but firmly. And Demeter, you understand the deep rhythms of agriculture better than anyone, but even you can't control every variable that affects the harvest. Weather patterns, solar intensity, the exact timing of seasonal transitions, these things matter too. Demeter's expression was carefully neutral, but Thalia could see the goddess weighing her words, looking for the trap, the insult, the dismissal of her ancient authority. What I'm proposing, Thalia continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction, is that you work together, not competing, not fighting for control, but actually cooperating, creating something that serves both divine power and mortal need, something that works with the natural world instead of trying to dominate it. The silence that followed was heavy with centuries of divine rivalry and wounded pride. What exactly are you proposing? Demeter asked, her voice carefully neutral, but with an edge that suggested she was prepared to reject whatever came next. Thalia took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to suggest would challenge everything both gods believed about their own authority. A partnership. A true partnership. Apollo's haircuts don't have to be random or driven by vanity. They could be intentional, planned, coordinated with the natural cycles that you, Demeter, understand better than anyone. Apollo's hair stirred around him, but uncertainly now. You mean scheduled haircuts? Like appointments? I mean seasonal haircuts, Thalia said, her voice growing stronger despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. 4 times a year, each one designed to work with the natural rhythm of growing things, Spring, summer, autumn, winter, each season triggered by a specific style, a specific length, a specific intention. Demeter's eyes narrowed. You're asking me to coordinate my ancient authority with his grooming schedule? I'm asking you both to serve something greater than your individual power, Thalia replied, meeting the goddess's gaze steadily. To create a system that actually works. And if I refuse? Demeter asked. If I decide that my way, the way that worked for millennia before he discovered his hair could grow crops, is better, then the world keeps dying, Thalia said simply. Because like it or not, Apollo's power is real now. It's part of the equation. You can fight it, or you can work with it. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Apollo looked between his sister and the mortal woman who was asking them to revolutionize the very foundations of divine authority. Tell me about this system, Demeter said finally, her voice giving nothing away. Thalia felt her heart race. Spring, she began, warming to her theme despite the danger. A short trim, clean, fresh, new. Apollo's hair at its shortest, allowing maximum sunlight to reach the earth. The season of planting, of new growth, of hope. Apollo nodded slowly, his hands moving unconsciously to his hair. I can feel it, he said wonderingly. The rightness of it. Spring should be bright, clear, unobstructed. Summer, Thalia continued, watching Demeter's face for any sign of acceptance or rejection. Styling. Apollo's hair grown out but carefully maintained, shaped, beautiful. The season of abundance, of full growth, of the sun at its strongest. Autumn, Demeter said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in her voice despite her resistance. A major cut. Harvest time. The hair falls like leaves, like grain being gathered. The season of reaping what was sown. And winter. Apollo finished, his voice filled with growing wonder. Growth period. My hair growing long and wild, but naturally now. The season of rest, of planning, of preparing for the cycle to begin again. Thalia nodded, her heart racing with excitement. Exactly. 4 seasons, 4 haircuts, each one serving a purpose, each one part of a greater whole. Not chaos, not control, balance. The 3 of them sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the elegance of the solution. Around them, the chaotic energy of Mount Olympus seemed to pause, as if the very air was considering the possibility of order. It could work, Demeter said finally, but it would require discipline, patience, the willingness to serve something greater than individual desire. I'm tired of serving only myself, Apollo said quietly. I'm tired of being afraid that I don't matter. Maybe mattering isn't about being needed. Maybe it's about being useful. Thalia smiled. Now you're beginning to understand. The first test came 3 days later, and Thalia had never been more terrified in her life. They had spent the time planning, discussing, arguing over details with the passionate intensity of people who knew they were creating something that could either save the world or destroy it completely. Apollo's hair had finally stopped its chaotic growth, settling into a length that was manageable if not exactly stylish. The ice flowers had melted, the confused vegetation had found its proper seasons, and Mount Olympus had begun to look less like a battlefield and more like a home. But the real test would be whether their system actually worked, or whether they were about to unleash something even worse than the original chaos. "Are you ready?" Thalia asked, standing beside Apollo in what they had designated as the new seasonal chamber, a room in his palace that faced all four directions, with windows that looked out over the mortal world below. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Apollo held his divine shears in hands that trembled visibly. "I think so. But what if I get it wrong? What if I cut too much, or not enough? Or what if the whole system fails and I make everything worse than it was before?" "Then we adjust," Demeter said, but there was tension in her voice too. "That's what partnerships are for. Correction, refinement, learning. And if we can't adjust fast enough?" Apollo asked, his voice cracking with fear. "If I destroy everything in the first cut? And then we'll face the consequences together," Thalia said, placing her hand over his. "But Apollo, look at me. You're not the same God who started this crisis. You've learned to listen. You've learned to feel the Earth's rhythm. Trust that. Trust yourself. And remember," she added, "you're not doing this alone anymore. We're all here. The Earth is here. The natural rhythm is here. But most importantly, you're not trying to control everything anymore. You're trying to serve something greater than yourself." For a long moment, he listened, really listened, to the deep pulse that connected all living things. He felt the needs of farmers preparing their fields, the stirring of seeds in winter soil, the patient hope of a world ready for renewal. He felt Demeter's ancient wisdom flowing through the earth, felt Thalia's mortal understanding of what the people truly needed. And for the first time since his hair had started growing with divine power, he felt ready. "Now," he whispered, and made the first cut. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The severed lock of golden hair drifted to the marble floor, catching the light like spun sunbeams. Thalia held her breath. Demeter's hands clenched into fists. Apollo's eyes remained closed, his face a mask of concentration and hope and terror. Then the change began. It started as a whisper, a subtle shift in the air pressure, a barely perceptible warming of the stone beneath their feet. But it spread like ripples in a pond, growing stronger with each passing moment. Across the Mediterranean, winter began its slow, graceful retreat. Not the violent, chaotic change of Apollo's previous experiments. Not the desperate, destructive power of a god trying to prove his importance. This was different. This was natural. Snow melted gradually, revealing earth that was ready to receive it. Soil warmed slowly, at exactly the pace that sleeping seeds needed to wake. The first tentative buds appeared on trees that had been dormant for months, but they appeared when they were supposed to, where they were supposed to, in the perfect rhythm of life renewing itself. "It's working," Thalia breathed, watching through the windows as the world below began to wake from its winter sleep. "It's actually working." Apollo opened his eyes, and they were bright with tears. "I can feel it," he whispered. "The rightness of it. the way it fits with everything else. This is what I was meant to do, isn't it? Not control the seasons, but serve them. Now you understand, Demeter said, her voice warm with approval. Power isn't about domination. It's about responsibility. It's about being part of something greater than yourself. They watched together as spring spread across the world. Not perfect, not without challenges, but natural, balanced, right. What happens next? Apollo asked. Next, Thalia said, we wait, we watch, we learn, and in 3 months, when summer is ready to begin, we do it again. And again in autumn, Demeter added. And again in winter. Apollo finished. A cycle, an eternal cycle. The way it was always meant to be, Thalia said. The system wasn't perfect at first. It took time to refine, to adjust, to learn the subtle differences between what Apollo intended and what the world actually needed. There were mistakes. A spring that came too early in the northern regions, leaving farmers scrambling to protect tender shoots from unexpected frost. A summer that burned too hot in the southern valleys, requiring Demeter to work overtime to keep the crops from withering. An autumn that lingered too long in the mountains, delaying the harvest until snow threatened the grain. But each mistake was a lesson. Each adjustment brought them closer to true balance. And most importantly, they were learning together. Apollo discovered that his power was actually stronger when it was shared, when it worked in harmony with Demeter's deep understanding of agricultural cycles and Thalia's ability to hear the Earth's true needs. The precision required was humbling, not just the right length of hair, but the right intention, the right timing, the right coordination with a dozen other factors he had never considered. Demeter found that her ancient wisdom was enhanced by Apollo's divine energy and Thalia's fresh perspective. For the first time in millennia, she wasn't fighting against unpredictable divine interference. She was working with it, shaping it, making it part of the natural order instead of a disruption to it. And Thalia learned that being a bridge between mortal and divine wasn't just about translation, it was about transformation. Every day brought new challenges, new adjustments, new moments when she had to help two immortal beings remember that their power was meant to serve life, not dominate it. You know, Apollo said one evening as they sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I think I'm happier now than I've ever been. Even though you're not in control anymore? Thalia asked. Especially because I'm not in control anymore, Apollo replied, his voice carrying a peace she had never heard before. Control is exhausting. It's lonely. It's empty. But this, being part of something, serving something greater than myself, this feels like purpose. This feels like home, Demeter added quietly, and there was wonder in her voice, as if she was surprised to discover that home could be something new, something shared. Thalia nodded, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. This feels like the beginning of something beautiful. But even as she said it, she knew the real work was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a late frost in Thessaly, a drought threatening the olive groves, 100 small adjustments needed to keep the delicate balance they had created. The system was working, but it required constant attention, constant care, constant cooperation between beings who had spent eternity learning to work alone. And far below them, across the Mediterranean world, farmers looked up at those same stars and felt something they hadn't experienced in months. Confidence in tomorrow. Not certainty. The weather would always be unpredictable. Crops would still sometimes fail. Nature would always hold surprises. But confidence that the gods were working with them instead of against them, that the seasons would follow a rhythm they could understand and plan for. The world was healing, slowly, carefully, one day at a time. And in a palace on Mount Olympus, three unlikely partners, a vain god learning humility, an ancient goddess embracing change, and a mortal woman who had dared to dream of balance, continued their work of creating something that would last forever. The eternal cycle of seasons had begun. But more than that, they had created something even more precious. A new way for gods and mortals to work together, a partnership based not on worship or fear, but on mutual respect and shared purpose. It was, Thalia thought as she drifted off to sleep that night, exactly what the world had been waiting for. Not perfection, but cooperation. Not control, but service. Not the end of challenges, but the beginning of facing them together. Tomorrow would bring new problems to solve, new adjustments to make, new lessons to learn. There would be setbacks, arguments, moments when the old patterns of divine rivalry threatened to resurface. The work of maintaining balance would never be finished. But tonight, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, the world was at peace. And that was enough to build on. On Chapter 12, The Eternal Cycle. 1 year later, Thalia stood in the seasonal chamber, watching Apollo prepare for what would become known as the first official spring haircut. Though she suspected that name would be shortened to something more practical by future generations, probably just Spring Cut or The Awakening. The chamber had transformed since that first terrifying test, but the change had been gradual, organic, like the growth of the seasons themselves. What had once been a simple room with 4 windows had become something approaching a temple, though not in the way mortals usually built temples. There were no golden statues demanding worship, no elaborate altars heavy with sacrifice. Instead, the walls were lined with carefully tended plants from every corner of the Mediterranean, olive branches from Greece that whispered of ancient wisdom, wheat stalks from Egypt that spoke of abundance, grapevines from the Italian hills that promised celebration, cedar boughs from Lebanon that carried the scent of eternity. Each plant had been chosen not for beauty, but for meaning, each one a living reminder that the seasons served life, not the other way around. The olive branches bore fruit in their proper season. The wheat stalks ripened when they should. The grapevines flowered and fruited in perfect rhythm. They were a testament to what could be achieved when divine power worked in harmony with natural law. In the center of the room stood a simple marble table, and on it lay the tools of their new trade. Apollo's divine shears, polished to mirror brightness, Demeter's collection of seeds from every crop that grew under the sun, and Thalia's own contribution, a leather-bound journal filled with observations, measurements, and the careful notes of someone who had learned to read the earth's moods like a farmer reads the sky. "And are you nervous?" Thalia asked, though she already knew the answer. Apollo was always nervous before a seasonal cut now, and she had come to see that nervousness as a good sign. A god who worried about getting it right was a god who understood the weight of his responsibility. Terrified, Apollo admitted, running his fingers through his hair, which had grown to exactly the right length for the spring cut. No more, no less. The chaotic, uncontrolled growth of his crisis was a thing of the past. Now his hair grew with intention, with purpose, responding to the rhythm of the seasons rather than the chaos of his emotions. "Good," Demeter said from her position by the eastern window, where she was monitoring the subtle signs that told her the earth was ready for spring's arrival. "Fear keeps you honest." It had taken them the full year to reach this point. 12 months of careful adjustment, constant communication, and the kind of patient cooperation that neither God had ever imagined possible. There had been setbacks, arguments, moments when the old patterns of divine rivalry had threatened to resurface. But they had worked through each challenge together, learning not just how to coordinate their powers, but how to trust each other. The system they had created was more complex than Thalia had originally envisioned. It wasn't just about Apollo's haircuts, though those remained the dramatic centerpiece that triggered each seasonal transition. It was about timing, coordination, and the delicate balance between divine power and natural rhythm. Demeter had learned to read the subtle signs in Apollo's hair growth, understanding when the earth was ready for each transition. Apollo had learned to feel the deep pulse of agricultural cycles, timing his cuts not to his own desires, but to the needs of growing things. And Thalia had become something entirely new, a bridge between mortal and divine, a translator who could help gods understand the real impact of their actions on human lives. "The farmers in Thessaly are ready," she reported, consulting her journal. "The soil temperature has been stable for 3 days, and the winter wheat is showing the first signs of new growth. The olive groves in Attica are budding, and the shepherds report that the ewes are beginning to lamb." "The earth's voice is strong today," Demeter added. "I can feel the life stirring beneath the soil, waiting for the signal to emerge." Apollo nodded, his expression serious. "Then it's time." But before he could reach for his shears, Thalia held up a hand. "Wait. There's something we need to discuss first." Both gods turned to look at her, and she felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that came with being the only mortal in a room full of immortal power. But it was a different kind of nervousness now. Not the terror of confronting a mad god, but the natural anxiety of someone about to propose something that would change everything. "This system we've created," she began, "it's working. Better than any of us dared to hope. The seasons are reliable, the harvests are predictable, and the world is healing. But there's one problem we haven't addressed." "What problem?" Apollo asked, his hand freezing halfway to his hair. "What happens when I die?" The words fell into the chamber like stones into still water, creating ripples of silence that seemed to spread through the very air. The plants on the walls seemed to droop, as if they too understood the weight of mortality. Apollo's hand froze halfway to his hair, his face going pale as winter frost. In all their planning, all their careful coordination, all their detailed discussions about timing and technique and the delicate balance of divine cooperation, they had somehow overlooked the most obvious fact. Thalia was mortal. She would age, she would die, and when she did, the delicate balance they had created would lose its most crucial component, the voice that helped gods understand mortal needs. "You're not going to die," Apollo said, his voice cracking with something that sounded almost like terror. "I won't let you die. I'll make you immortal. I'll grant you eternal life. Apollo, no." Thalia's voice was gentle but implacable. "That's not the answer. Making me immortal doesn't solve the problem. It just postpones it. What happens in 100 years, or 1,000, When I've been away from mortal life so long that I forget what it's like to worry about the harvest? What happens when I become just another immortal who's lost touch with the people we're supposed to serve? She gestured toward the plants surrounding them. Look at these. They're beautiful because they live and die in their proper seasons. The olive tree doesn't try to live forever. It lives fully, bears fruit, and passes its legacy to the next generation. That's what makes it perfect. Demeter was nodding slowly. She's right. Immortality changes you. It has to. When you have forever, it becomes easy to forget that others don't. Then what do you propose? Apollo asked, his voice small and lost. Thalia smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had found the perfect solution to an impossible problem. We create a tradition, a role, a position that can be passed down from one mortal to another, generation after generation. She opened her journal to a page she had been working on for months, covered with careful diagrams and detailed notes. The page was worn from handling, stained with ink from countless revisions, marked with the kind of careful attention that spoke of something precious being crafted. "So, the calendar keeper," she said, her voice carrying the weight of something sacred being born. A mortal who serves as the bridge between divine power and human need. Someone who watches the seasons, records the patterns, and helps ensure that the system continues to serve life rather than power. But how would we choose them? Demeter asked, leaning forward with interest despite her earlier skepticism. How would we know who could handle such responsibility? The wrong person could destroy everything we've built. The same way you chose me, Thalia replied, her voice growing stronger with conviction. We look for someone who can hear the Earth's voice, someone who understands that true power comes from service, not control, someone who cares more about the harvest than about their own importance. She paused, then added with a small smile, "Actually, I think I may have already found the first candidate." Apollo was staring at her with something approaching awe. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" I've tried to," Thalia admitted. "Because this system, what we've built together, it's too important to depend on any one person. It needs to be bigger than us, stronger than us, more permanent than any of our individual lives." She turned to a fresh page in her journal, one that contained the most important words she had ever written. "I've been working on something," she said. "A guide. Instructions for future calendar keepers. Everything I've learned about reading the Earth's moods, about timing the seasonal transitions, about helping gods remember their responsibility to mortal life." She held up the journal, and both gods could see that it was thick with careful observations, detailed measurements, and the accumulated wisdom of someone who had learned to bridge two worlds. "This is my real contribution," she said. "Not just helping you two learn to work together, but creating a system that can outlast all of us. A way to ensure that the seasons will always serve life, that the harvest will always matter more than divine vanity, that mortals will always have a voice in the decisions that affect their survival." Apollo reached out and gently took the journal from her hands, handling it with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. As he flipped through the pages, his expression grew more and more amazed. This is incredible." He breathed. "You've documented everything. Every pattern, every adjustment, every lesson we've learned. This isn't just a guide. It's a complete system for maintaining the balance we've created. It's more than that, Demeter said, looking over his shoulder at the careful diagrams and detailed notes. It's a way to ensure that future generations will understand not just how to maintain the system, but why it matters. You've captured the wisdom we've gained, but also the heart of what we're trying to accomplish. Thalia felt a warmth spread through her chest. Not the Earth's voice this time, but something purely human. Pride, satisfaction, the deep contentment that came from knowing she had created something that would outlast her own brief life. "So," she said, "are you ready to make this official? To perform the first seasonal haircut of what will hopefully be an eternal cycle?" Apollo looked at the journal in his hands, then at Demeter, then at Thalia. When he spoke, his voice carried a gravity she had never heard before, the weight of someone who understood that they were creating something that would outlast empires. "I'm ready," he said. "But first, I want to make something clear. This isn't just my haircut, or Demeter's agricultural wisdom, or even your mortal insight. This is our system, our creation, our gift to the world." He stood slowly, and as he did, something changed in the chamber. The air itself seemed to thicken with divine presence, the plants on the walls rustling without any wind, the very stones beneath their feet humming with power. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a ceremony, a moment when the mortal and divine worlds touched and something new was born. He handed the journal back to Thalia with a formal bow that would have seemed ridiculous a year ago, but now felt as natural as breathing. Demeter rose as well, her form shifting subtly to encompass all her seasonal aspects: the green growth of spring, the golden abundance of summer, the rich harvest of autumn, the patient rest of winter. "Achakikund, Thalia of the Earth listeners," Apollo said, his voice carrying the weight of divine proclamation that would echo through the ages. "I name you the first calendar keeper, guardian of the seasonal balance, bridge between mortal and divine. May your wisdom guide this system for as long as the earth turns and the seasons change. And may those who come after you carry on this sacred trust," Demeter added, her voice equally formal but warm with genuine affection. "May they remember that power serves life, not the other way around. May they keep the harvest sacred and the seasons true." Thalia felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy, of completion, of purpose fulfilled. The earth's voice rose around her like a chorus, singing approval, singing welcome, singing the ancient song of life continuing. "I accept this responsibility," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "And I swear by the earth that gave me voice, by the seasons that taught me wisdom, by the harvest that feeds us all, that I will use this trust to serve the balance we have created, to protect the growing things, and to ensure that the voices of mortals are never forgotten in the councils of the divine." As she spoke the words, she felt something settle around her shoulders like an invisible cloak, not a burden, but a mantle of purpose that would guide her for the rest of her days. The formal moment passed, and Apollo grinned, the first truly carefree expression she had seen from him since the crisis began. "Now," he said, picking up his divine shears, "let's make some spring." The haircut itself was anything but anticlimactic. Apollo stood in the center of the chamber, his divine shears catching the light from all four windows, east for dawn and new beginnings, south for the full strength of day, west for the gentle decline toward rest, north for the deep wisdom of winter's sleep. The plants on the walls seemed to lean toward him, as if they could sense that something momentous was about to happen. "Are you ready?" Thalia asked, her journal open to a fresh page, her pen poised to record this moment for all future calendar keepers. "Are you?" Demeter asked, her hands pressed against the eastern window, feeling for the exact moment when the earth would be ready to receive spring's gift. Apollo closed his eyes and took a deep breath. For a moment, he simply stood there, listening, not just to the earth's rhythm, but to the harmony they had created together. He felt Demeter's ancient wisdom flowing through the soil, felt Thalia's mortal understanding of what the people truly needed, felt his own power settling into its proper place as servant rather than master. "Now," Demeter whispered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had felt the earth's readiness in her very bones. Apollo opened his eyes, raised his shears, and made a single, precise cut. The lock of golden hair drifted to the marble floor like a falling star, and for a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then the change began. It started in the chamber itself, the plants on the walls stirring with new life, the olive branches putting forth tiny buds, the wheat stalks straightening with renewed vigor. But it didn't stop there. It flowed outward like ripples in a pond, spreading across Mount Olympus, down into the mortal world, across the Mediterranean and beyond. Winter began its graceful retreat, but this time it was different. This time, Thalia was ready with her journal, carefully recording the exact length of the cut, the time of day, the atmospheric conditions, the subtle signs that had indicated the Earth's readiness. This time, Demeter was coordinating the transition, using her ancient wisdom to guide the change and ensure it happened at exactly the right pace. This time, Apollo was serving the season rather than commanding it, his power flowing in harmony with forces greater than himself. And this time, it felt permanent. Not just another experiment or adjustment, but the establishment of something that would endure for as long as the world turned. "How does it feel?" Thalia asked as they watched spring spread across the world below. "Right," Apollo said simply. "For the first time in my existence, it feels completely right." "Like coming home," Demeter agreed. Thalia nodded, making one final note in her journal. "Like the beginning of forever." Years passed like the turning of pages in Thalia's ever-growing journal. Seasons turned with the precision of a master craftsman's work, each transition smooth and purposeful. The system they had created proved its worth through drought and flood, through the rise and fall of empires, through all the countless changes that marked the passage of mortal time. Thalia aged, as mortals do, but she aged with purpose. Her hair grew silver, her hands developed the calluses of someone who spent her days writing and tending plants. Her eyes gained the deep wisdom that came from watching the world turn through countless cycles. But her connection to the Earth's voice never faded. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year. She trained her successor, a young man named Alexios from Crete, who had arrived at Mount Olympus 3 years earlier, drawn by dreams he couldn't explain and a voice in the earth that called to him across the sea. He was different from Thalia in many ways. Where she was patient, he was eager. Where she was cautious, he was bold. Where she listened first and spoke second, he sometimes had to be reminded to stop talking and start hearing. But he could hear the earth's voice almost as clearly as she could, and more importantly, he understood what it meant to serve something greater than himself. The olive groves in Attica are ready. He reported one spring morning, consulting his own journal, a gift from Thalia, bound in leather from the same hide as hers. The soil temperature has been stable for 5 days, and the trees are showing the first signs of new growth. And the farmers? Thalia asked, testing him as she always did. Hopeful but cautious. Alexios replied without hesitation. Last year's harvest was good, but they remember the chaos from before. They're watching the sky, watching their fields, waiting for the sign that spring has truly come. Thalia nodded approvingly. He was learning to think not just about the divine mechanics of seasonal change, but about the human hearts that depended on it. She refined the calendar keeper's guide constantly, adding new observations and insights with each passing season. The journal had grown thick with accumulated wisdom, notes on weather patterns, soil conditions, the subtle signs that indicated when each transition should occur. But more than that, it contained the heart of what they were trying to accomplish. The understanding that power served life, not the other way around. She watched Apollo and Demeter grow into their roles as partners rather than rivals, their cooperation becoming so natural that it was hard to remember they had ever been enemies. Apollo's vanity hadn't disappeared entirely. He still took pride in his appearance, still enjoyed the way his hair caught the light, but it had been transformed into something useful. His beauty now served a purpose beyond itself. And when her time finally came, she faced it with the same courage she had shown when confronting a mad god in his ruined palace. It was autumn, fitting, she thought, for an ending that was also a beginning. The leaves outside her window were turning gold and crimson, preparing for their own graceful departure. Apollo sat beside her bed in the small house she had built near the seasonal chamber, his hair grown long for the winter season, his face marked with a grief that was both divine and utterly human. Demeter stood by the window, her form shifting subtly between the abundance of harvest and the quiet preparation of winter's rest. Alexios waited near the door, his young face solemn with the weight of the responsibility he was about to inherit. "Are you afraid?" Apollo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," she said, and meant it. Her voice was weak now, but her conviction was as strong as ever. "I'm proud. We created something beautiful, something that will last. The seasons will turn long after I'm gone, and they'll turn in service to life rather than vanity. That's enough. That's more than enough." "You saved us," Demeter said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "All of us, gods and mortals alike." "We saved each other," Thalia corrected, her eyes moving between the two immortals who had become her dearest friends. "That's what cooperation means. That's what love means." She turned to Alexios, who stepped forward at her gesture. "The journal is yours now," she said, her voice growing fainter but no less determined. "But remember, it's not about the words on the pages. It's about listening, always listening. The earth will tell you what it needs if you're quiet enough to hear." "I will," he promised, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "I'll guard the balance. I'll serve the seasons. I'll remember." Thalia smiled, and it was the same smile she had worn when she first proposed the impossible idea of cooperation between gods. "Good. That's all any of us can do. Remember and serve and pass the gift along." She closed her eyes and listened one last time to the earth's voice, still strong, still steady, still singing the ancient song of seasons turning and life renewing itself. And in that song, she heard something new. The voices of future calendar keepers, mortals not yet born, who would carry on the work she had begun. She heard Alexios's voice joining the chorus, and after him, others, an unbroken chain of guardians stretching into a future she would never see but had helped to create. The eternal cycle would continue. As her breathing slowed and finally stopped, a gentle breeze stirred through the chamber, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the promise of spring's return. The plants on the walls rustled softly, as if the earth itself was saying goodbye to one of its most faithful daughters. And in the silence that followed, Apollo and Demeter and Alexios felt something settle around them. Not grief, though that was there too, but a sense of completion, of purpose fulfilled, of a life well lived in service to something greater than itself. The first calendar keeper was gone, but the tradition she had created would endure. Today, thousands of years later, the seasons still turn in the rhythm that Thalia, Apollo, and Demeter created together. Spring still comes with Apollo's short trim, clean and bright, allowing maximum sunlight to reach the awakening earth. Summer blazes with his carefully styled locks, golden and abundant. Autumn arrives with his major cut, hair falling like leaves, like grain being gathered. And winter rests during his growth period, patient and preparing for the cycle to begin again. Most people have forgotten the true story, of course. They think the seasons are simply natural, inevitable, the way things have always been. They don't know about the vain god who nearly destroyed the world with his hair, or the ancient goddess who learned to share her authority, or the mortal woman who taught them both that true power comes from service. But the calendar keepers remember. In hidden chambers around the world, beneath the Vatican's ancient foundations, in a secret room behind the British Museum's Egyptian collection, in a cave high in the Himalayas where the air is thin and the earth's voice carries clearly, they maintain the ancient tradition. They watch for the signs that indicate when each seasonal transition should occur, recording the patterns that keep the system balanced, ensuring that the voices of mortals are never forgotten in the turning of the great wheel. They are farmers and scientists, gardeners and meteorologists, people who have learned to listen to the earth's voice in their own ways. They don't all know about the others. The tradition is too precious, too fragile to risk exposure. But they all carry the same sacred trust that Thalia first accepted in a ruined palace on Mount Olympus. And sometimes, if you know how to listen, you can still hear the earth's voice whispering the truth that Thalia discovered so long ago. That cooperation is stronger than control, that service is more powerful than dominance, and that the most beautiful things in the world are created not by gods or mortals alone, but by both working together in harmony. The seasons turn, the harvest comes, life continues. And in a palace on Mount Olympus that exists just slightly outside the normal flow of time, a god who learned humility sits down 4 times a year to cut his hair in service to something greater than himself. His shears are still polished to mirror brightness, his technique still perfect, but his heart has been transformed. He cuts not for vanity, but for love. Love of the growing things, love of the mortals who depend on the harvest, love of the balance that keeps the world alive. Somewhere in the mortal world, a calendar keeper opens an ancient journal, not the original, which crumbled to dust centuries ago, but a careful copy, and a copy of that copy, an unbroken chain of wisdom passed from hand to hand across the generations. They read Thalia's words, written in her careful script. Listen first. Serve always. Remember that power is only beautiful when it serves life. The eternal cycle continues, as it always has, as it always will. And that, perhaps, is the most beautiful haircut story ever told. Not because it's about hair, but because it's about learning to serve something greater than yourself, about finding beauty in cooperation, about the courage to change and the wisdom to listen. The seasons turn, and in their turning, they carry the echo of a mortal woman's voice, still teaching gods and humans alike that the most powerful magic of all is working together.